Tell me when. Good morning, councillors. Good morning, executive, and good morning to those joining us in the digital gallery today for the ordinary meeting of Tuesday, the 21st of September 2021. It's my privilege to declare the ordinary meeting open. In doing so, I'd acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet and also that form the footprint of our great region. And again, pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend congratulations to them on their continued nurturing of culture. I note absent on a leave of absence, Councillor McGuinness is not with us today, and Councillor Chalk is with us via remote connection. We hope that stays stable, Councillor. I note a full attendance of the CEO and executive and a number of officers who will be joining us for matters before us today. On that basis, I have no additional apologies to note. Therefore, turn to prayers, and I believe we have on standby to join us today Reverend Helen Paget from the Anglican Church, Boonah Harrisville Parish. And I thank you, Helen, for joining us today, and I open the floor to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm struggling to hear you, but yes, I think I've got it.
We can hear you.
Okay. This morning or today is International Day of Peace. Each year it is observed around the world on the 21st of September, and the UN General Assembly has declared this as a day devoted to strengthening the ideals of peace through observing 24 hours of non-violence and ceasefire. And I'd like to pray this morning that this day may truly be a day of non-violence and ceasefire everywhere. Let us pray. Lord God, whose will it is that all people should live in peace and unity, bless the United Nations organisation and all those who work within it and support of it, that succeeding generations of humanity may be saved from the scourge of war, and the nations of the world may learn to combine their efforts for the common good of all humankind through Jesus Christ our Lord. For God, whose purpose of love embraces the whole world, send peace upon earth, that the nations may no longer prepare for war, that they may try to understand, not destroy each other, remove bitterness and hatred, and grant that all people of all nations and backgrounds may learn to live in fellowship together. Lord God, you have taught us that we are members one of another, and that none of us live to themselves alone. We thank you for the community of which we are a part, that those who share with us in its activities and all who serve its various interests. Help us as we have opportunity to make our own contribution to the community and to live to be good neighbours, that by love we may serve one another for the sake of Jesus Christ our Lord. Almighty God, from whom comes every good and perfect gift, grant to those who hold office in the Scenic Council the spirit of justice and truth, of wisdom and charity, that mindful of their responsibility and of the needs of those they serve, they may promote the true welfare of your people and advance your kingdom on earth through Jesus Christ our Lord. And we invite you to pray the Lord's Prayer with me. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Save us from the time of trial and deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever. Amen. And this morning, because it is International Day of Peace, this morning in Brisbane, in St John's Cathedral, the Anglican Cathedral in Ann Street, in the presence of senior government representatives and prominent figures in the field of culture and multicultural organisations, 2 young girls will be singing the national anthems of the 193 nations of the world of the United Nations to promote world peace, the empowerment of children and women, a real sense of humanity, and also to advocate for an end to climate change. They will be singing non-stop for 6 hours. They will sing the national anthems of 193 countries from memory, using more than 100 languages.
Thank you. That's very enlightening. Thank you, Helen. It's been wonderful to have you share with us this morning, and it is very thought-provoking and timely to consider, given the state of many situations around the world. I have heard of those 2 sisters, I believe, who've been coached in that endeavour for quite some years to be where they are. So that'll be a stunning effort. So,
I mean, one of them still at school, and they've been learning these national anthems for the last 6 years.
Correct. So, look, thank you, Helen. You're welcome to continue to join us in the digital gallery, but I'm sure your day has many busy moments, as do ours. Thank you again, and we shall proceed with the matters before us and look forward to talking to you again in the near future.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Pleasure.
Okay. Bye. God bless.
Councillors, we turn to item 5 in today's agenda, and that is the declarations of prescribed or declarable conflict of interest by members. Councillors, I'll hereby giving notice that I have 2 declarable conflicts of interest relating to items 11.1 and 11.2 within the agenda of today's meeting. These conflicts arise because I am an involved party with the 2 matters to be considered. I'm intending to leave the meeting for the consideration of both items. Councillors, other declarations? Councillor Swanborough?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Similarly, I have a terrible conflict of interest on both of those items as well, and I also will be leaving the meeting accordingly.
Councillor, any other declarations, councillors? I have no announcements. We're on minutes for today, and we have no... One moment. Sorry, we just have had some challenges. We're just a bit loud now. We just had a few technical, just be careful pulling your microphones forward, councillors, it unplugs your cords. So please trust the technology and don't play. Is that polite enough? Thank you. We have no deputations or presentation of petitions notified for today's meeting. Turn it both ways. So I'm down as low as I can. So I don't know that makes Now he's fixed it under there. Thank you. We're just having some technical reconfiguration adjustments, I think is the broad term. We turn to item 7 of the agenda, councillors, and that's the confirmation of minutes of the ordinary meeting first of the 7th of September 2021. And I shall read, we have a recommendation before us that the minutes of the ordinary meeting held on the 7th of September 2021 be adopted. I seek a mover first. Councillor West, thank you. Any questions to that recommendation or to those minutes, councillors? Not. I seek a seconder. Councillor Enright. Any need to speak, councillor?
No, thank you.
Anyone wishing to speak? If not, we put the motion. Those in favour? That's carried. We move to the... Sorry, Marshall, I forgot. Apologies, Marshall. You have to... I can see you, so you can give an indication. Yes, thank you. Thank you. I keep looking at the screen and watching for you, so don't slide down your chair. We move to the special meeting the 14th of September 2021, and we have a recommendation that the minutes of the special meeting held on the 14th of September 2021 be adopted. Seek a mover. Councillor Enright. Any questions to those minutes? Seek a seconder. Councillor McConnell. Any need to speak, councillor? Anyone else wishing to seek to speak? Not. We put the motion. Those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. There's no business before the meeting today arising from those previous meetings, so we move to section 10 of our agenda, and we move to item 10.1. Chief Executive, would you introduce this item, please?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good morning, Mayor, councillors, executive officers and members of the public listening at home. Item 10.1 is about the repealed and reappointed show holiday for 2021. Just probably going back as a little bit of history here, Mr. Mayor, councillors will recall at the ordinary meeting of 17th of August 2020, it was resolved that council nominate Monday of the 2021 Royal Brisbane Show, 9th of August 2021, as a public holiday. In early August, all councils who marked the Royal Brisbane Show, the Echo, with a public holiday were asked to provide advice within just a couple of hours as to whether we would like to seek a repeal of the region's show day in view of the cancellation of the Echo and the lockdown then in force in southeast Queensland. And given that the lockdown would extend at least until Sunday, 8th of August, the day before the scheduled Scenic Rim show holiday, it was considered to be in the overall community and local businesses' best interests if a repeal of the holiday was sought. And our feedback to the Office of Industrial Relations indicated, yes, that we would be interested in a new date. We felt that there would be benefit also if that day was different to the Brisbane day. On 17th of August, the Queensland Government announced that Friday, the 29th of October 2021 was to be the appointed day in Brisbane, Moreton Bay and Scenic Rim, and that's since now been confirmed in legislation. So I have a recommendation there for Council, Mr. Mayor.
Councillors, any questions to the report? You're familiar with the background, but are there any points of clarification you wish to raise? If not, I'll ask CEO if you'd introduce that recommendation, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The recommendation is that Council note the decision of the Queensland Government to create a 2021 People's Long Weekend by appointing Friday, 29th of October 2021 as a public holiday in the Brisbane City, Moreton Bay and Scenic Rim regions in place of the repealed show holidays in those local government areas.
Councillors, I seek a mover. Councillor Swanborough. Any additional questions? Any additional discussion? If not, I seek a seconder. Councillor McConnell. Councillor Swanborough, you wish to speak? Anyone seeking leave to speak additionally? If not, we put the motion as per the recommendation. Those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. We move to item 10.2 and GM Customer and Regional Prosperity.
Mr Mayor, I'll take this.
CEO, you'll introduce the first one. Thank you.
Thank you. As you know, our organisation is full of many talented people, and one such employee is Deborah Howe, our General Manager of Customer and Regional Prosperity. Councillors are aware that Deborah has currently and has in the past been a judge in the Queensland Tourism Awards. Recently, Deborah received an invitation to represent Queensland as a national judge at the 2021 Australian Tourism Awards. Obviously, this will be an opportunity to mix with many tourism industry professionals and also to put Scenic Rim on the map in this regard. The invitation came from Daniel Gershwin, CEO of Queensland Tourism Industry Council, seeking Council's support for Deborah, which I granted at the time. I do note that any costs associated with Deborah's participation will be met by the Australian and Queensland Tourism Industry Councils. Deborah's giving up some of her own personal time, and there'll be some minimal time impacts on this organisation, but certainly the benefits certainly outweigh some of those time impacts, Mr Mayor, and there's a recommendation there accordingly.
Thank you, CEO. Councillors, any questions to this report? Councillor McConnell.
Just a quick one to the GM, if I can. I see the judging period is for 6 weeks. The CEO just mentioned that most will be in your own time. How much time do you expect to use in that 6 weeks committed to judging?
Of my own time?
Correct.
So I understand the process works that once all of the state awards announcements have occurred, and the Queensland Awards will happen at the end of mid-November, then the judges across Australia will be allocated categories to judge, and subject to the number of categories, and then naturally whether the finalists, so the winners of each state will go in. So you'll then be awarded either 1 or 2 categories. For example, for the Queensland Tourism Awards, I'm currently judging 2 categories, and there are, I think, 18 submissions to go through. So it will just depend on the size of the category and obviously whether there were winners announced for every state, because in some cases there might not be. And then you'll need to, then each of the judges needs to judge those over a period of time as a team. And then, so there's time where you caucus with your team, and then the rest of the time you judge in your own time.
So a lot of this judging is stuff that you'll be able to bring back to the Scenic Rim. Is that a fair assumption? As in a lot of the initiatives that other states and areas, you'll be able to use that to bring that sort of knowledge back to the Scenic Rim?
So noting that I sign confidentiality agreements for the judging process, and that I don't judge anything in my state or in the case of Queensland in this region, and that I don't see any submissions that this organisation might submit. The knowledge that I would gain, I think, is really valuable in how then we, as a economic development tourism team, guide without divulging any of the content that we witness, but to just see the initiatives and to understand some of the things that organisations have put in place, particularly in this period of time where COVID has been such a huge impact on businesses. I'm right in the middle of judging at the moment. I still have 7 submissions left to judge this week that I've been doing each evening, and it astounds me just the amazing initiatives that businesses have put in place in order to survive and thrive through this period. And I think some of those initiatives and the way we've seen businesses pivot, the sustainability and diversification initiatives that they've put in place, I think will be very valuable learnings for both myself passed on to the economic development team who work with the tourism operators, and through the roles and the partnerships that we have in the region with, say, Destination Scenic Rim, and that would be without divulging any of the confidential details for any of those businesses.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Swanbury, you have a question?
Yeah, just a question. Are you required to physically go and visit each of these, or are they desktop assessments that you're doing?
About 3 years ago, Australia moved to a common standard across all of the state awards, then ultimately rolled up into the national awards. And in doing that, they transitioned to a portal. So all of us judge now in a portal. So I'm a team leader of a Queensland team judging at the moment, and we caucus by phone, but we have Google Docs and shared spreadsheets and judge through the portal and record all of our comments. So everything is done remotely. And then once the national awards open, the same thing will happen. All of the winners out of the state will go up into the categories that we get awarded, and we will do those remotely.
Thank you. Councillor Enright.
Thank you, Mayor. And a question also to the GM, noting some of the previous comments. I note the report outlines the opportunity to raise the profile of Scenic Rim in the tourism community, and also an opportunities to proactively assist in the potential future tourism opportunities. And I just wondered if you could outline just how some of those opportunities may occur through your ability as a judge of these awards.
Thank you, Councillor. I think that the interactions that we're having for the Queensland Awards, we have 2 face-to-face judging days, and the network of judges that come from the depth and breadth of Queensland is quite astounding. Some of the talented people that we're interacting with. Also, the close working relationships with the Queensland Tourism Industry Council. Our own Shane O'Reilly from O'Reilly's here in the Scenic Rim is actually the chair of the board of the Queensland Tourism Industry Council. So I think Scenic Rim is well regarded in the tourism industry and growing almost on a daily basis. So I think that the interactions, the networking and the relationships and potential future partnerships that could be made just by being involved at such a close level, I think will have value back to not only to myself, but also to the team and to the region, being able to share and pass on some of that knowledge.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Any additional questions for clarification? If not, would you, CEO, introduce the recommendation, please?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The recommendation is that Council acknowledge the appointment of Deborah Howe, General Manager, Customer and Regional Prosperity, as a national judge for the 2021 Australian Tourism Awards.
Seek a mover. Councillor McConnell. Any additional questions? Any additional discussion, councillors? No, I seek a seconder. Councillor West. Councillor McConnell, you wish to speak?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think we've covered it.
Thank you. Anyone seeking leave to speak additionally? If not, we put the motion as per what's on the screen and it's been read. Councillors, those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors, and GM, we wish you well with those endeavours. We turn to item 10.3 on page 12 of the agenda, councillors, and this time, GM, we turn to you.
Thank you, Mayor, councillors, executive and everyone in the digital gallery. Today, it's really pleasing to present the Scenic Rim Economic Stimulus Package number 3, COVID-19. This report has been a joint effort across all of the portfolios to prepare a set of initiatives and a set of activities and projects that are aimed at stimulating the economy and to mitigate some of the impacts from the COVID pandemic. I don't think I need to give much background as to the impact that this pandemic has had both on the state, national, regional, state, national and world economy. And throughout that, we've seen a stifling of businesses and both community organisations struggling to survive and thrive through what has been, dare I say, some unprecedented times for them to navigate. There are over 300 community organisations in the Scenic Rim, and this package particularly recognises the issues that have been associated for community groups locally. There is a study that was actually discussed this morning on ABC Radio that talked about some 70,000 community organisations across Australia with impacts of over 83% of them, whereby it said the loss of earnings due to not being able to operate, the stifling of community sport, the issues around volunteerism and now failing memberships because people have no reason to stay connected to these groups is putting community sport and other organisations under a great threat. So I think it is very timely of this organisation to have taken the steps that they have through this report to address and potentially offset some of the operational deficits that have been experienced by community organisations. As I said, the report has been prepared across the different portfolios and the different business units, and I have with me today Deborah Moore, the Manager of Community and Culture, and Randall Deans, the Manager of Health, Building and Environment, who have contributed to this, along with Brenda Walker, who is unable to be present in the room today, that have prepared a range of initiatives that are outlined in the report. And Mayor, I'm not going to go through them because there's so many in there, but just to point out one of the, in relation to assisting community groups, that Council is looking to establish the COVID-19 community stimulus funding, and within that create a community grant that will enable organisations experiencing financial loss or hardship resulting from COVID-19 to apply for some funding to offset their operational cost deficits and assist those organisations to continue to operate as they navigate the situation they find themselves in. I'm happy for either myself or officers to take questions. I think all of the different initiatives really are clearly outlined in the report.
Thank you, GM. It's a very comprehensive report. Councillors, any questions to the report for clarification? Councillor Enright.
Thank you, Mayor. My questions probably follow up from the introduction of this item and the process for community groups, acknowledging the difficult time that they have experienced over the last 18 months, but the process for them to participate in the opportunities outlined in the stimulus package.
Thank you, Councillor. So the COVID-19 community grants guidelines are attached to the report, and today we'll be asking Council to adopt those. They've been developed by Deborah Moore and Cathy Forrest. That outlines what community organisations will need to do in order to apply for the assistance for the offset of operational cost losses. It's a relatively straightforward process that many of the organisations will have experienced in the past by having applied to our other community grants programs and be able to just apply through our Smarty Grants portal. The rest of the initiatives that are in here will sit with different teams. So those at the top of each of the columns in the report in Table 1, it talks to the teams that are overseeing or delivering those projects. So, for example, the first tranche is community and culture, so supporting the community. The second tranche is planning and development, where we're looking to assist businesses to pivot and adapt to the changing models that they may need to seek some assistance from a planning department to operate potentially outside of some conditions whereby there's no health and safety issues impacting. And there's some other discounts that planning team are offering. The third tranche is the regional prosperity group a team supporting Scenic Rim businesses. The fourth tranche is health, building and environment, supporting businesses through the reduction of some of our fees and charges, specifically for licences for food and premises, and some other applicable local law licences for campgrounds, caravan parks, keeping of animals and commercial use on roads. And the final tranche is procurement through council sustainability, managing the increase of local spend to ensure that council is first and foremost seeking quotes from local businesses to ensure that we're procuring our goods and services for businesses based within the Scenic Rim. I do also want to point out there are two dates that are incorrect in this report. References that to the 31st of November and the 31st of June. We apologise for those errors, and they'll be they are meant to be obviously the 30th. Some months were moved around, but the date, the numbering wasn't changed. So I just want to also point out those errors in the report, councillors.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, councillor. Further questions, councillors? Councillor Swanborough.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Look, I think it's a great overall package. Just one question for clarification is on page 21 of the report, and it's in relation to planning and development, supporting Scenic Rim development. And the heading there is assist businesses to pivot and adapt to changing business models. And the assistance to be provided is assistance for businesses that may need to temporarily operate outside of some development conditions where health and safety is not affected. The sunset clause of this, as just pointed out, is the 30th of June 2022. My question is in relation to compliance that may be occurring on any business during this period of time. Just how will a condition that gives discretion to officers to waive development conditions, how will that be determined, and how will it impact on those businesses that are subject to compliance who may now want to appeal those conditions and be caught by this provision?
Thank you for your question, councillor. The report doesn't specifically say that officers will be waiving anything. The report talks to requests for this offers would need to be approved, so it would depend on the scale of the request. I have some examples where in this last year, when because this particular item is a repeat that council adopted in package 2, and for example, there may be a business who doesn't have the ability to do takeaways, for example, so whereby food and beverage businesses needed to close quickly, they may not have had all of the right permits and allowances in place, and it was that kind of assistance that we were providing. It's not a grand scale, you can carte blanche now operate out of your conditions, so anyone listening online need to be aware of that this is around where there is an impact from COVID that means they need to do business differently as a part of potentially a long-term strategy they might wish to put in place, that officers would be open to them making that request, working through that request, looking at how significant it is, whether it's has any other issues that come with it, and then looking at what is the process for approving that. It might be that the discussion needs to come back to the council about that, and it could be that it's someone who realises now they need to adjust their business model and potentially have that conversation with us and then start a formal process to put that in place as well. So this is not a carte blanche, everybody can start acting outside of their conditions. There is a structured process that we're asking people to contact us, and that we would work through to understand what in fact that issue is.
And which council officer at what level will be responsible for the final sign-off on those changes?
As I just stated, it will depend on the scale of the request. If it's something within the delegation, then that will either sit with the Manager of Planning and Development, Mark Lohman, and if it is something more significant that requires a further consideration, officers would bring that forward for the discussion with councillors before any approvals would be given.
Could there potentially be a request for change in operating hours from daylight to night time, for instance?
Well, without preempting what every business in the Scenic Rim is looking for, certainly that could be one thing. Someone may see a need for that depending on demand. Someone may have increased demand. There are businesses here that are doing very well as a result of COVID, and some may need to move to 2 sets of shifts, for example. If that was the case, we would need to look at that and look at any impacts that may occur as a result of that request. And this is, if you see in the wording there, it's temporarily operate outside of some of their development conditions. So if anyone wanted to put anything more formal in place beyond a temporary approval to do that, they would need to go through the normal processes and apply for that as a long-term outcome for that business.
And the report puts a proviso in there where health and safety is not affected. Would it be appropriate to also put a proviso in there where public amenity could be affected, such as noise, dust, odour, light emissions and operating times?
I think we, as professional officers, I think most of what you've just mentioned there would probably either have a health impact or a safety impact. So I think it's a catch-all, and we would consider any of those that you've just mentioned. This is not about this is about enabling business. It's not about upsetting anybody in the region, including resident population or businesses that are surrounded by residents that might be impacted. So I think what you've said there would be captured in the officer's assessment of any request that came in. I'm very confident with that.
Could I ask a question following on from that? This is identical to what we put in place previously.
That is correct.
Were there? Can the GM advise whether there were any difficulties or challenges as a result of putting this in place last time?
No, there were no real wholesale, people racing to our doors to ask for multiple changes to development conditions. I have the Manager of Health, Building and Borough, and I think you'll find most of some of the ones that were asked were around quickly pivoting and being able to, food businesses and hospitality businesses being to operate potentially, like I said before, takeaway operations that they didn't have in place, or different, a couple of different trading hours, but there were no wholesale, people storming us asking for conditions to be altered overnight as a result of this being put in place last time. This is seen as an action of being enabling, and we welcome the conversations for any businesses that are struggling or having difficulties with their conditions or trading in the region to come forward, have a concept meeting with our officers at no cost, and talk through those issues so we can look at the best method to assist them.
Further questions, councillors? If not, can we move forward to the recommendation, which is, I think, has a number of parts.
Has a lot of parts in there, Mayor. If you're agreeable, Mayor, I thought that I would read through to number 6 and then the table, unless you specifically wish me to read everything in the table. I'm happy to read the headings in the table if you wish.
I think we might perhaps just read the heading. The headings in the table might be helpful for those listening.
Sure. Happy to do that, Mayor. So before you, councillors, today there is a recommendation that 1, Council adopt the Scenic Rim Economic Stimulus Package 3 COVID-19 as detailed in Table 1 below. That 2, Council adopt the COVID-19 Community Grants Guidelines, refer attachment 1, in support of Scenic Rim community groups with diminished operational capacity and that are experiencing financial loss or hardship due to COVID-19 impacts. That 3, Council endorse the allocation of $250,000 for the COVID-19 community stimulus funding, and that this be ratified by inclusion in the September 2021 budget review. And 4, that Council acknowledge the proposed reduction of licence fees for food premises and other applicable local law licence fees by 25% as outlined in Table 1 may result in the potential waiving of approximately $47,000 in fees and charges revenue. And 5, that Council delegate authority to the Chief Executive Officer to undertake any actions required to give effect to the Scenic Rim Economic Stimulus Package 3 COVID-19. And 6, that Council monitor and report the progress of the Scenic Rim Economic Stimulus Package 3 COVID-19 as at 31 December 2021 and conduct a further review prior to its conclusion on 30 June 2022. Just adjusting that error there. Table 1 of the Scenic Rim Economic Stimulus Package 3 COVID-19 includes initiatives under Community and Culture, the Back on Track program, Be Healthy and Active program funding, the Community Grants program, the COVID-19 Community Stimulus funding, offering of flexible acquittal process for council grants program, and offer of in-kind assistance for community organisations. Under Planning and Development, assisting business to pivot and adapt to changing business models and assist new business with cash flow controls. Under Regional Prosperity, engagement of independent counselling service, Scenic Rim event workshop, regional events program and grant writing workshops. Under Health, Building and Environment, licence fees for food premises and other applicable local law licence fees reductions. Procurement, prioritise Scenic Rim-based businesses as part of Council's procurement activities.
Thank you. Well done for getting through that. Councillors, I seek a mover. Councillor Enright, any additional questions, councillors? Any additional discussion? If not, I seek a seconder. Councillor West. Councillor Enright, you wish to speak?
Thank you, Mayor. I would like to speak to this. I think this is a very important step to take, and I commend the officers, the staff and the officers in putting together this diverse range of support for both our business community, but most importantly, our community groups, well, equally importantly. I think it works well in support of our previous resolution for the rates discount and the offering of the financial hardship policy. It provides an avenue to assist those businesses who are struggling, and it is a challenging time. I think it's responsible for us as a local government to provide a responsible level of assistance to our community, as the state and Australian governments have done so. I think we all have to have an opportunity to play a part in supporting our community, and I commend this recommendation, this motion.
Thank you, Councillor. Anyone wishing to speak against? Anyone seeking leave to speak additionally? Councillor West.
Thank you, Mayor. Look, I believe this package will be very well received by the community, and I thank all our officers who've been involved in this. I just want to mention especially the community groups, our 300 community groups, who I really believe have tried to survive through various lockdowns, but now life has become rather tough for them. And I probably draw attention to children's sport, which has been very affected, with children not being able to play with children from outside the area. So I certainly know that the sporting groups will be very appreciative of this. Thank you.
Anyone else seeking leave to speak additionally? I will take the opportunity to commend this motion and this package and the contents of it. Many of the elements are replicas of what was put in place last year during the first stages of this ongoing COVID-related event, and were seen to add value in many ways for the community at that time. Of course, we've already done some activities around rates deferrals and so forth. However, I think the inclusion, as has been indicated, the inclusion of support at emergency level for some of our community groups is an important consideration. They've had limited capacity in many cases to raise revenue. This is not about trying to keep their balance sheet whole, and therefore there is limited resource available, and it does need to focus, as per the guidelines, to those who are really truly struggling. So we need to have that expectation managed. And I'd also just note this is going to include a level of unbudgeted expense that wasn't considered, and that's something we will also be needing to consider and deal with as a variation when we come to budget review time. But I believe it's well worth the effort to do that and to show that support at this time. Anyone else seeking leave? If not, Councillor, you wish to close? No, thanks. Righto. I'll put the motion then. Those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. Thank you, officers, for the diligent work in that preparation. And I thought it was very clever in the report to actually try and squeeze an extra day into the year in a couple of places. But
we just love being here.
There is just so much that's within our power, and that's not. So thank you for correcting that. And we look forward to seeing how that unfolds and hearing the update reports. We now turn our attention to item 10.4 of today's agenda. And again, GM, I'll ask you to introduce this item, page 29 of the agenda, councillors.
Thank you, Mayor and councillors. Today is the 10.4 is the 2021-2022 Scenic Rim Community Grants Round 1 outcomes. Have with me for this report Deborah Moore, the Manager of Community and Culture, and Cathy Forrest, the Principal Specialist for Community Development. The report is reasonably self-explanatory with the volume of information that is in there. After Cathy presents the process that occurred for the assessment of the minor and major grants, I am going to just present to Council a bit of discussion about some grants that were deemed eligible but unfortunately unfunded, and just to have a discussion around how Council might wish to consider those moving forward. So I'll pass over to Cathy to speak about the outcomes of the minor and major grants. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. As you have the reports in front of you, as you all know, the Council Grants Program is to provide assistance to the local not-for-profit community groups and organisations who make a positive contribution to the quality of life in the Scenic Rim. The grants program includes Stream 1 for minor community grants and Stream 2 for the majors. The maximum amount of funding for the minors is $5,000 and the maximum for the majors is $20,000. And there is only one round of the major grants each year. So in keeping with our usual process, applications were called from the community for round 1 on 1 July, and then they closed on the 30th of July 2021. It was promoted on its usual platforms, including Council's website, other online platforms, and we do a targeted email to all the community groups in the region. Unfortunately, the grant program information sessions we like to run as part of these were all cancelled due to COVID, but as we've highlighted in the report, the community has been very accommodating. I think they've learned to be under the current situation with COVID situations and restrictions. And even despite that lack of face-to-face contact, they were still able to access all the council officers by phone and or email, and they certainly took up that opportunity if it was needed. And we continue to see the quality of the inquiries, the applications are improving. And we do still get positive feedback about Smarty Grants and the transition of the whole online platform. We feel it's a much cleaner process, more streamlined. So just to give you the details of the report there, it's in round 1, we now have a total of 46 minors and majors received, valued at approximately $394,000. And we just put a comparison in there to round 1 last year, which attracted 68 applications valued at approximately $650. So you can see the difference. And we've just put that down most likely to the COVID. That's a big decrease and the uncertainty, I guess, around those potential lockdowns and the ongoing restrictions. And even despite that, the program has still been oversubscribed, which demonstrates that this program is still in demand and it's addressing a community need. Due to the calibre of the applications, most of the eligible projects have been fully funded, which allows community groups to meet their funding obligations more confidently and achieve better outcomes for their respective projects instead of maybe some of the previous ways of partly funding. It made it very difficult for community groups to meet those acquittal obligations. You have the tables in front of you. The minors are valued at $79,222.77, and then you move into the report. We've listed the majors that have been successful. Happy to take any questions. And we just highlight there that we do use a rigorous selection process to assess all of the grants, and they're all scored against the same criteria. And as the General Manager mentioned, there will be some discussion on the ones deemed eligible and not funded. We have a few minor and major community grants further along in the report that didn't meet all of the assessment criteria based on that scoring process, and they were not successful and not recommended for approval. And we've listed those, and as always, we're more than happy to have conversations with any of those community groups to continue building their capacity so that they can submit for future grant applications. And we just want to highlight in the conclusion of the report, this grants program is providing assistance to local community groups and organisations who make that positive contribution to Scenic Rim. And we know that, Council recognises that supporting these community organisations through financial assistance is essential in helping them develop and deliver programs, activities and projects that provide cultural, recreational and community development opportunities in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, GM, yes.
Thank you, Kathy and Mayor. Just further to Kathy's point, on page 35 of the report, I beg your pardon, as Kathy mentioned, there are 8 major community grant applications that were in this assessment deemed eligible, which means they passed the criteria, and should there have been more budget, are likely to have been funded. But unfortunately, due to the scale of the budget for the major and minor community grants, were not able to be funded as a part of this round. And as Kathy said, because the resulting in the oversubscription. Councillors, I draw your attention back to the previous report that has just been adopted by Council unanimously. Under that COVID-19 community stimulus funding, there is mention actually of the provision of provision of additional budget allocation for community grants in the 2021 and 2022 round 1 major grants. So essentially referring to these 8 major community grant applications that were deemed eligible but unfortunately unfunded. And should the September budget review actually provide the additional COVID-19 community stimulus funding of $250,000, it is Office's intention that we would mobilise the COVID-19 community grant guidelines, whereby community organisations can apply for some funding for their operational costs. And it is also the intention of officers that we would work with these 8 major community grant applicants who were deemed eligible but unfunded, with the potential of them being considered for funding underneath that additional funding in the COVID-19 community stimulus funding package of $250,000. Should all of these then move to the finish line in that process, that would be a further $144,535.61 worth of major grants being provided to those 8 organisations.
Thank you. Councillors, questions to the report? Councillor Enright, you're quick off the block.
Thank you, Mayor. If I just may ask Kathy to the Principal Specialist, feedback or an understanding of the process that the community groups are going now using Smarty Grants, how that's going. You mentioned about the quality of the report, and in addition to that, was there any feeling about the impacts on their organisations outlined in that program that we touched on the previous report?
And your first part of your question is, yes, they continue to, they're quite embracing of the new process, and I think we've talked about previously, they're more asking about the actual project as opposed to the actual process. So they seem to have embraced the process of moving to an online platform. And again, we've mentioned previously, most of the grant programs now moving to these online platforms, as in the community benefit funding is all now online, and it's a very similar format. A lot of your funding programs have now moved on to a similar portal. So it's been, at least we could test the waters with those. And so the community groups are feeling quite happy about the process. That wouldn't be perfect for everybody, but we always step them through and they seem to appreciate that guided discussion. And once you give them a few tips, they're on their way. They're quite fine. Even uploading of documents has proven to be quite good as well onto the system. No glitches, yeah. And the second part of your question, forgive me, can you just repeat that?
Yes, certainly. In their applications, were they outlining any challenges that they were facing, perhaps year to date from previous years or things like that?
In terms of just their general operating and what's going on for them as a group?
Particularly the COVID impacts.
Yes. Yeah, and we hear it all the time. Yes, they've all been impacted by sporting. I will take the point around community sport has been heavily impacted, and more the nature of young people being able to just interact and be involved in a sporting game. That's had a huge impact on the operational, but a lot of our smaller community groups, the ones that have not been able to do any fundraising, come together even, I mean, they've all been really amazing and pivoted and done their Zoom meetings if they have to meet online and handle some of those governance and their constitutional issues within their constitution. But yeah, they're all missing that face-to-face contact, and it's had a significant impact on their fundraising capacity to actually host events. So that's really affected maybe that operational bottom line type stuff. So we are hearing that quite a bit.
Thank you. Councillor Swamber, you.
Yes, the question is, with the major grants, are they generally just offered once per year? Is that what it is, or is there normally 1 or 2 rounds in a year for major grants?
The majors are only offered once per year, and it's because of the significant amount of funding in comparison for the Scenic Rim. So that 20,000 is usually meant for quite a substantial infrastructure project, and we need to allow them time to be able to fulfil the obligations attached to that. So we often find giving them a 12-month period to actually either construct or build a lot of these infrastructure ones. They take a lot longer than the smaller minors, and so that's just the nature of a major grant. And if they do need to use it for seed funding, there's usually a time frame attached to that as well. So once a year is adequate to allow the types of community groups we have in the region, which are mum and dad clubs, to be able to fulfil those funding obligations under the majors.
Thank you. Further question, Councillor Swanbury?
If an applicant for a major grant was not considered because of a minor technicality in the assessment process, would that club be contacted and that drawn to their attention in order for them to be able to correct that situation?
Yes, generally we have a pre-eligibility requirement for them to proceed into the assessment phase. So there's generally a conversation or email, there's usually some notification to the group about meeting some basic requirements to get them through that eligibility process. So there's normally some level of communication with the club. And we're always encouraging the groups to make contact with us as well, to talk through their application even before they submit. We can't stress that enough. There's just certain bits and pieces that probably community groups need to be more familiar with, and we're certainly building their capacity in that regard. But if we, and look at any of the outcomes from the grants program today, we will always follow up with those community groups and have a conversation with them around their capacity and their project.
Thank you. Further questions, councillors? GM, as you've indicated, there is a recommendation relating to this, but there was also an additional query that you indicated regarding these additional 8 projects and the connection to the prior motion. So how would you like to proceed that matter?
As the 8 that I mentioned are already identified in the previous report, they're not in the recommendation for today because this report is dealing simply with the community grants, round 1, minor and major grants that were approved. So the rest will play out, Mayor, as we go through the budget process and then work on in the implementation of the stimulus package.
So whilst you've notified that possibility today, the intent, just for the clarity of the meeting, is that that would come forward as a further report once we've finished the budget review.
Yes, because that will be contained in the budget review, Mayor.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Councillors, If there are no other questions, we'll return to the recommendation before us today.
With the leave of the meeting, Mayor, I'll read the actual recommendations and not list all the...
I won't ask you to read all of the items in the report.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. So the recommendation before you, councillors, is that 1, council approve the allocation of minor and major grants under the Community Grants Program 2021-2022, round 1, for a total of $176,752.77, outlined as follows in the table. Minor community grants of $79,222.77 and major community grants at $97,530. And 2, that council provide relevant feedback and advice to unsuccessful grant applicants to continue building capacity of the community sector to apply for community grants.
Thank you. I seek a mover. Councillor Enright. Any additional questions? Councillors, any additional discussion? Not. Seek a seconder. Councillor McConnell. Councillor Enright, you wish to speak?
Thank you, Mayor. I would. Very delighted to move this motion. I believe it is an indication of the support that we provide to our community groups through this very successful and oversubscribed, often oversubscribed community grant process. Our community groups are really ones that enhance our social fabric, and whether that's through our sporting groups, whether that's through our community groups, they just provide so much benefit well beyond the dollar value of our investment in this community grant process. And when I think to the outcomes, and I'll just pick out a few, like the Burner District Chamber of Commerce with their Threads of Christmas, the Fassifern Lions Club, what they do for the Calbar Country Day, the Lions Club of Beaudesert for the carols in the park this year, the Tambourine Mountain Orchestral and Choral Society for their orchestral concerts, and the Turning Canungra Pink. You know, what fantastic things they do for our community. Perhaps one of the biggest challenges in this last 18 months have been the impact on our sporting clubs and for them to raise funds. And I'm delighted to see that so many of the sporting clubs were successful in getting some major funding to enable the area that they manage on behalf of council, in most cases, for their operations to continue. And I'm delighted that this will, subject to the September budget review, that this will extend the opportunities for other sporting clubs into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Anyone wishing to speak against? Anyone seeking leave to speak additionally? If not, we will put the motion. Those in favour? That's carried unanimously. We move, thank you for the work of officers in that process of evaluation and development of the detail and the support of the ongoing improvement of that business development aspect with our applicants. So thank you. We move to item 10.5, councillors, and this relates to the draft major amendment for the planning scheme. GM.
Thank you, Mayor and councillors. Coming into the room, I hopefully...
Page 39 in your report.
Page 39, 10.5. I have today the Principal Specialist Strategic Planning. We have the Manager of Planning and Development and the Principal Specialist of Development, Assessment and Engineering. 10.5 is the endorsement of the draft major amendment to the Scenic Rim Planning Scheme 2020 for the State Interest Review. I'm going to hand over to Heather Nelson, who will be presenting this, councillors, but I guess this is a really important phase in having adopted the planning scheme last year, the next step of how we are progressing with any subsequent amendments required. So I'll hand over to Heather.
Thanks, Deborah. So this is a draft major amendment that's been prepared to the Scenic Rim planning scheme in keeping with the commitment to keep the planning scheme a living document and respond to emerging issues. This amendment package is a major amendment package and it includes 20 major amendment items. It's made up of items that were left over from the public consultation for further review in 2018 and 19 of the planning scheme, and also issues that have arisen through the implementation of the new planning scheme over the last year. In our view, there's 4 key items that present major policy changes, and those are the facilitation of small-scale craft breweries and distilleries in the commercial zones, an amendment to facilitate groundwater extraction for water supply on Tamborine Mountain, an amendment to enable subdivision of lands that's divided by a state-controlled road in the rural zone, and amendments to dual occupancy code and level of assessment for dual occupancies. And the remaining items, they help clarify policy matters that exist already but are defined as major amendments under the ministerial guidelines and rules. There's one rezoning in Maroon of land that was formerly used for a church. It's being rezoned to the rural zone. There's some clarification in definitions, amendments to industry thresholds, and another outstanding matter from the public consultation of the planning scheme was more support in the township zone for tourism activities. So I'm happy to take questions on specific items.
Thank you for that introduction. Questions to clarify to the report, councillors?
Just got a couple if I can. Page 55 of the report, or 8 of your report. It talks about the Tamborine Mountain water supply being in the rural precinct only. When we already have several that aren't in the rural, so does that mean?
Yeah, we're proposing to only allow these new groundwater extraction local utilities in the rural precinct of Tamborine Mountain because these are large lots. They're reflective of the intended uses in that precinct, which are mainly rural uses. We don't really want to encourage groundwater extraction for local utility in rural residential areas on Tamborine Mountain.
That's good.
Further question, councillor?
Yeah, the other one is specifically to, where are we? I think it's page 54. Is this specifically to Tamborine Mountain water supply? I mean, we have some issues with water going off the mountain. Are these restricted to supplying of Tamborine Mountain who don't have reticulated water? They're all on tank water?
We're not restricting that the water that's collected on Tamborine Mountain must stay on Tamborine Mountain, but at the same time, everywhere else in the rural zone, the region, this use is already code accessible. So, and it's not likely that groundwater is taken from the mountain elsewhere because of the transport that's involved in the first place. It's probably just going to be contained on the mountain anyway.
Yeah. At the moment, we have a lot of water going off the mountain though.
Yes, Councillor, in relation to that, there's 2 purposes for which groundwater extraction is occurring on the mountain at the moment. One is for what we generally term as local supply, for topping up tanks in residences and businesses on the mountain. The other is it goes off-site for bottling. And now most of what you were experiencing at the moment when we talk about water going off the mountain is going off for bottling purposes. What this amendment is doing is addressing the local supply issue. So it doesn't affect any existing levels of assessment or the like in relation to the bottling side of things, which by definition we put under extractive industry. So it's a separate definition to what we're talking about here.
Thank you.
Councillor Swanbury, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. Just in relation to that, the manager rightly points out that it's local supply. The definition only talks about water supply. would it be prudent to include the word local in that definition?
We had that discussion. From a planning perspective, we're unable to really do that because it's a restriction of trade, essentially what it comes down to. However, we're reasonably confident that it is unlikely that water supply for, extraction of water for water supply for household top-ups is unlikely to go off the mountain in a practical sense, because when you look at the logistics of it, taking the tankers up and down the mountain has traditionally been an issue when we get drought situation, because water tankers on the off the mountain tend not to want to go up onto the mountain, so the reverse would apply. The other issue is that at Tamborine in the village and at Canungra you have top-up points there for tankers as well, so it's unlikely that's like the need to take water off the mountain, drive past top-up points would be practical or cost effective. So in practice, we believe you'll effectively get a local supply, but we can't mandate that. And that's backed up by recent or past court precedents where once it leaves the site, we can't dictate where it goes. So yeah, I'm comfortable we'll achieve what you're probably looking at in a practical sense.
Thank you. Further clarifications, Councillor Swanbury?
Yeah, there is a scenario where those smaller tankers could be called upon to provide water in the region. I'm talking about Wongawal and Claggarabah, or maybe not Claggarabah, they've got a Gold Coast water supply, but anywhere west of Tamborine Mountain. Those small trucks could then be accessing water on the mountain and delivering it off to somewhere else. And it sort of defeats the purpose. And whilst you say I can't envisage it,
Councillor,
I'm sort of thinking, well, I could envisage it.
So, Councillor, this is asking questions for clarification, not creating arguments, which that was. So please just respect the process.
Yeah, I'll put the question mark on the end of my statement.
Well,
is this the case?
Mark on the end of it. So it was very clear your intent, Councillor, so please respect the process. There's an opportunity for that. Thank you. Would you manage your exercise response to what?
Okay, not 100% sure of the question, but yeah. I'll just go back to my statement before, is that within the planning terms, we would be unable to restrict it to within the region, simply because that would be a restriction of trade.
Well, my question is, if that is the case and the intent of what you're trying to do cannot be guaranteed, why are we making this amendment, which is going to open up more sites for water extraction on the mountain?
Because every time we get a drought, we are requested to provide more local supply points on the mountain. And this is in response to submissions in the planning scheme originally when they went out for public consultation. The practical problem with on the mountain is that there is a limited number of supply points. We've only got 2 or 3 at the moment. If we are in drought, there is a struggle for them to supply, and we have had instances in the last couple of years where supply times have gone out from 4 to 6 weeks to provide water, and which, for most people, they actually do, they can run out in that time. The problem with starting up an impact accessible extraction point is that it is a significant cost to do that. That then leads to the issue, well, it's because local supply is not, how we say, very commercially, it's not a big money maker. Because if you have rain, you might not supply any water for 12 months. So for someone to go and actually put in the investment for local supply, spend tens of thousands of dollars doing it, it's just not going to happen. It hasn't happened in the past. So what this amendment is seeking to do is provide in the rural precinct on Tamborine Mountain the opportunity for someone at a lower setup cost to provide a point for operators to be able to collect water to provide for the locals. And this would particularly occur in drought situations where the current supplies are insufficient. So that's what it's about. It's about protecting the water supply for Tamborine Mountain for the locals.
Further questions? Thank you, Councillor Enright.
Thank you, Mayor. If I ask Heather regarding item 4, the amendments to the dual occupancy code and level of assessment for dual occupancies, what is the intent of this amendment?
Thank you. The intent of this amendment is basically to avoid concentration of dual occupancies in our new residential neighbourhoods in the low density zone and the low medium density residential zone. The low medium density residential zone occurs in Beaudesert, and in other, the low density zone is in other growth areas such as Calba and Boona. And currently the planning scheme leaves open the potential for dual occupancies to be self-assessable, and they could occur next to each other. There's nothing limiting that from occurring, and we're proposing an amendment that seeks to encourage dual occupancies firstly on corner lots, because that's considered a good design outcome. You can get access from 2 separate streets and maximise private open space opportunities. And secondly, we're increasing the minimum lot size for accepted development subject to requirement. And we're also, when a development is code accessible, we're looking at making sure they're not located within 50 metres of another dual occupancy on the same side of the street. And that's a proposed acceptable outcome in the code for code accessible development. So by doing these measures in combination with the level of assessment, where we think that it'll be an improved outcome in where these developments occur, and also urban design wise in terms of facilitating lots that can have private open space for the individuals who use the land, and also on-site car parking, not requiring the street for car parking as well. And also by making sure that they're not concentrated in one area, the development density that was intended for that area is not unintentionally increased by dual occupancies doubling the dwelling density.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Councillor West, do you have a question?
Just a bit of clarification. Excuse me. I just wondered, Heather, if you could just clarify briefly item 16, the amendment 16, which is about tourist parks in the rural zone, and also the mobile vendors, which are item 19. They're often matters that concern the community.
Yeah, so item 16 is not really a change, it's more a clarification, but because it involves a level of assessment, it constitutes a major amendment. What was happening was a tourist cabin development that involved cabins would initially think they were self-assessable, accepted subject to requirements in their planning scheme, but by looking at the code provisions, they automatically are bumped up to becoming code accessible because they wouldn't meet the acceptable outcomes, being that you can't include cabins in that development. So we're not actually changing the policy about cabins that are part of tourist parks. We're just clarifying up front the way people use the planning scheme is that they read the tables of assessment first. So they'll know straight away that if you're doing cabins as a tourist park, you're not going to be accepted subject to requirements.
Thank you.
The second question was mobile vendor. We're including some clarity around that definition. Can you just remind me what item number that was?
19.
19. Thanks. So in the current planning scheme, we refer to an itinerant vendor when we're talking about temporary use opportunities. We're clarifying when these vendors can establish, say, a food van on a site in terms of how long and what land uses they can operate on. We've changed it to mobile vendor, and we've included a new administrative definition, and that is that any person who engages in a temporary business of selling or delivering goods, wares, foods, foodstuffs or merchandise from either a public or private place other than at their permanent place of business or residence. And an example is a mobile coffee van. And the proposed amendment says that as a temporary use, you can operate on land that's currently used for a hotel, service station, shop or shopping centre or a community use. One vendor per day, so you can't have 2 trucks on the site, and per site per week. So that means 1 coffee van can go to one of these places once a week.
I just have one more question, and it's mainly for those who are listening at home, just about the process in the event of subject to approval today. What are the next steps and what are the timelines before the community
Okay.
to be consultated?
So we're seeking council's endorsement for this amendment package to go through the state interest review process. The state will review this amendment having regard to the state interests, which are the regional plan and the state planning policy in this instance. They've got 60 business days to do that. Sometimes they come back to the strategic planning scheme team and ask for further clarifications. And we're also asking the minister's permission to undertake public consultation on this proposed amendment. So subject to the outcomes of the state interest review and any conditions that we might get from the minister to publicly consult this amendment package, we'd be looking at public consultation of 20 to 30 business days. And I think that's likely to happen early next year, given the timing from now.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Enright, do you have a further question?
Couple more items, if I may. Thank you. Item 8, the reduction in side and rear setbacks for lots 1 hectare or less in the rural zone. Mind just outlining the details of that, please?
Yeah, we were finding that on smaller lots in the rural zone, we were getting a lot of code accessible applications coming in seeking to reduce the current side setback, which is 3 metres, I think. 10 metres, 5 and 9. And we're basically saying that if you're in the rural zone on a lot that's 1 hectare or less, we'd consider a side building setback of 4.5 metres. Where your building is up to 4.5 metres, you can have a 3 metre setback, and where it's bigger than that, 5 metres. So that's a reduced side setback for the smaller rural lots. So people can accommodate a shed on the land, maybe in the corner where it's better, making better use of the land that they actually do have on those smaller rural lots.
So we've made those setbacks consistent with the rural residential A print zone. Because that lot size is probably more consistent with the rural res, even though they are zoned rural. And within the rural zone, there's a wide range of lot size, and we do have quite a number of small blocks where the setbacks probably didn't work as anticipated, because there were large lots in mind that you want to keep them back from the boundaries and the like, but it was very difficult for small lots to do that, particularly when you take into account on-site constraints on those blocks. They might have steep areas or trees, whatever they're trying to avoid, and under a hectare that limits their options on where to locate buildings. So we were finding we're getting a number of requests to vary those setbacks, which they're very practical requests, and they were supported. So we felt that it was more appropriate to put on more of a rural residential type setback for these small blocks. Yep.
Thank you for that clarification. My final one is item 13, the inclusion of new boundary realignment definitions. What was the intent of that one?
Yeah, thank you. We're including an additional administrative term for boundary realignments to just clarify that by boundary realignment, we mean a minor adjustment to the boundary of existing lots that share current boundaries, because we were seeing some circumstances where applicants were proposing to do a boundary realignments where a lot was perhaps across the road and didn't actually share a current boundary. So we're clarifying that in the planning scheme, a boundary alignment has to share a current boundary to be considered to be realigned.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillors, any other points of clarification to the Councillor Swanley?
Just a question in relation to the going back to the Tambourine Mountain water issue. I wonder if someone could explain to me what the actual definition of water supply is in this amendment.
We're proposing a new definition. So when a defined term is included in planning scheme. Firstly, it's italicized. So the table of assessment will indicate that we mean groundwater extraction for water supply, and the proposed definition for water supply means, in respect to groundwater extraction, the provision of bulk water to on-site storage facilities to be used for the following: A, household and residential purposes; B, the watering of animals; C, watering plants, garden or lawn; and D, non-residential uses where used on site. Examples include water supplied to dwelling houses, shops and nurseries.
So my next question is, given that definition, how do you see that conflicting with restraint of trade provisions?
Because it's in the levels of assessment. So we're saying, and we do this throughout the level of assessment in the planning scheme, it's activities that are of a certain level or a certain activity, and that's how we separate them out. And so in some cases it might be where the shop is, you know, under 200 square metres, they're one level of assessment. Over that gross floor area, they're another level of assessment. So it's not actually a restriction of trade. It's just identifying that we see as a council that if someone is wanting to set up a development for water supply and that meets this criteria, then within the levels of assessment, it would become code assessable and consistent with the planning scheme, rather than being impact assessable and inconsistent with the scheme.
Thank you. Okay, any further questions, councillors? Councillor Chalk, I've been watching for you to put your hand up, so I'm presuming if you wanted to speak.
I've just got one more question.
Sorry, Councillor Swanborough.
Just on that particular matter, I just want to ask the Manager of Planning if Council's taken any legal advice from a planning barrister in relation to the effect of this amendment to give us confidence that what we're trying to achieve can be achieved.
Throughout the development of the planning scheme, and particularly in relation to this area, we've had numerous advice from legal sources. We tend not to speak specifically of it, but we have taken advice on how we deal with water extraction on the mountain. And part of that was in the development of the planning scheme in relation to the splitting of the definitions as a public utility, which is what we're talking about here, supply of water for the public and for domestic type uses, and splitting it away from what is locally called bottled water supply, which is an extractive industry. And that was based on legal advice and legal precedent that came out of a number of cases that occurred on Tamborine Mountain about identifying that water extracted for the bottling purposes would be considered an extractive industry. Strangely, the same as would be a quarry or the like, because it's extracting a natural resource. So that's the basis of how we've decided this. And look, I'll just go back to say that what we're trying to do here is provide for supply of water, domestic water, particularly on Tamborine Mountain, and allow for, you know, potentially a couple of new operators on there to ensure that the water supply on the mountain is not compromised, particularly during periods of drought, or should, you know, any of this existing suppliers, you know, stop supply for whatever reason. So it's about guaranteeing supply on the mountain. That's why it's there.
Further question, Councillor?
My further question is it a use of the planning scheme to be able to give a temporary planning permit for extraction purposes over this rural land, taking into consideration that, as you rightly point out, this is a very cyclical thing and it only happens during periods of droughts and it's not economic any other time. So can it be a control in the planning scheme that application can be made to council under the planning scheme for a temporary supply of water? And would that be a tool that could perhaps lessen the threat of uses being approved and finding out that the water is being taken off the mountain.
So in the last couple of droughts when water supply was an issue on the mountain, this matter was looked at quite in detail. And there are provisions within the Planning Act to allow for emergency development, essentially, where it's required for public health or safety. You know, people running out of water in a household would fall under that, the public health provision. Again, you run into the issue of the practicalities. That if someone was, with council's concurrence, setting up an emergency supply, they've got to do that investment in creating the bore, the tanks, the sterilisation, getting the health permits and the like, at very short notice and only for the time of the emergency. So if anything, it's actually more of a financial risk to do that for an emergency situation than it would be to set up a more permanent situation. So that's why we've provided, you know, or recommended to council to provide for water extraction in this quite specific circumstance on the mountain.
Thank you for that clarification. Any further questions, councillors? If not, we do have a recommendation before us that I'd ask the GM to introduce.
Thank you, Mayor and Councillors. The recommendation before you today is that 1, Council endorse the attached Scenic Rim Planning Scheme 2020 Draft Amendment number 3 to undertake a state interest review in accordance with the requirements of Chapter 2, Part 4 of the Minister's Guidelines and Rules, and 2, that Council request approval from the Minister for State Development, Infrastructure, Local Government and Planning to undertake public consultation on the draft amendment package following the state interest review in accordance with the requirements of the Planning Act 2016 and Chapter 2, Part 4 of the Minister's Guidelines and Rules.
Thank you, councillors. I seek a mover. Councillor Enright. Any additional questions, councillors? Any additional discussion? Seek a seconder. Councillor McConnell, you wish to speak, Councillor Enright?
Thank you, Mayor. Look, I think this is a positive move to ensure that our planning scheme, that is now only 18 months old, remains current. It provides an opportunity for major amendments to ensure for clarity on many items, provides an up-to-date criteria for some businesses that 18 months ago may not have been needing that clarification, and provides the ability to enable where we want our planning scheme to fit to provide the correct development into the future. And I think this move will be one of many into the future, but it certainly provides the opportunity for the state interest review to assess the vision for our region, and then the opportunity for this to go out to public consultation. I see this as a very positive move for our planning scheme and for our region.
Thank you, Councillor. Anyone wishing to speak against? Anyone seeking leave to speak additionally? Councillor Swamborough.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Look, I'm going to support this recommendation because it's just more than Tamborine Mountain. It's been a long process to put all these changes in place, and I'm not going to stand in the way of that. And the reason is that there is another period of time after the state interest check. It'll come back to council and it will go out to public consultation. So there is a time that the public and others can more fully consider some of these issues, especially the water supply issue on Tamborine Mountain, and that is because, you know, there are a lot of other points of supply on Tamborine Mountain, but unfortunately they're not in the rural zone, and they could be fired up very quickly, and maybe there are provisions to allow that already, which is something that needs to be explored, and I'm not sure at this point in time how many of those are on rural land, but I suspect there only may be one. So I'm going to vote in favour of this with the proviso that there are some questions and considerations that will need to be addressed in the coming months in relation to that issue. Thank you.
Anyone else seeking leave to speak? I would just speak briefly to this and support this moving forward through this process. The great challenge that we identified when we were going through the arduous task of the officers who carried most of that challenge of trying to find a place of balance. Much of what's in here is actually dealing with some of the unintended variations that needed to be corrected as a result of getting that first round of an integrated scheme together. But the next challenges that we need as an ongoing conversation in these amendment packs is in fact dealing with the balance between strong views in community, and the challenge is the state has a view and their view ultimately holds sway over everything regardless of public consultation or our view. It's the state that determines what gets accepted, as we know, into our scheme, and we had some knockbacks previously. But the challenge as we move forward is that there are mixed voices in our community, and we need to be able to provide a framework that plots a sensible path through that balances the risks on nearly everything that we consider. And that's never going to be easy. And the position of community on certain issues will change depending on the season in some circumstances. So, in fact, I'm well aware personally of people who've held 3 different views on certain issues that are being addressed here today in the last 4 years, depending on what they were seeing as their personal circumstance. That's the challenge we face. I commend officers for the diligence and the work that's gone in to deal with this thus far, and I support putting this forward for the state to consider and to try to get out for public consultation. Any others wishing to speak? Back to you, Councillor. You wish to close?
No, thank you, Mayor.
Put it to the vote. Those in favour? It's carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. I'm conscious that it is now 10:51. And we have a matter which I suspect will take some time to work through. So to those in the gallery, I'm going to offer you a 20-minute reprieve, and we shall take a 20-minute break, councillors, and return at approximately 10:10. Thank you. 11:10, sorry. Apologies. Okay. Welcome back, councillors, executive and officers. Welcome back the digital gallery. We now continue with the ordinary meeting with agenda item 10.6. GM, are you introducing?
Thank you, Mayor and councillors. 10.6 is related to MCU 20/105 as wholesale nursery and garden centre at 176 to 180 Long Road and 133 Eagle Heights Road, Tambury Mountain, described as Lot 2 RP 84569 and Lot 21 RP 891952. I have officers with me that are going to present this report: Wayne Jarrett, Principal Specialist Development Assessment and Engineering, and the Manager of Planning, Mark Lohman. I'll hand straight over to Wayne, who is going to introduce this item for the MCU. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Deborah. This application is to validate the land use currently being conducted on the premises, and also seeks to obtain development approval to expand the scope of the nursery to include more land area for the wholesale operations and to include the retail component, which was an ancillary component to the existing operations. The nursery activity employs around 10 people and has been active on the subject properties for approximately 20 years, and in particular on 176 to 180 Long Road. The site is heavily utilised for plant propagation, with the bulk of the plants being grown on tables within the covered structures. The balance of the site largely being used for ancillary functions for plant propagation, such as storage, access and potting.
Each of the two properties includes a dwelling house. One is the home of the business owners, the other is being rented to some of the employees. The application triggered impact assessment against the planning scheme, requiring public notification. We received a total of 13 properly made submissions during the public notification period, with 11 of the 13 submissions indicating some form of support for development. This included the majority of directly adjoining neighbours. So the proposed development has demonstrated compliance with the relevant codes and planning scheme through the submitted material, which included special reports on stormwater management, and happy to take questions regarding the application.
Thank you, councillors. It's a fairly large report. You've had time to consider. Are there questions? Sounds no points to clarify to the report. If not, Councillor Enright.
Mayor, could I ask about the level of intensity or coverage on the two blocks, and what makes up GFA, and what makes up and how outdoor area is treated?
Certainly, thanks, Councillor. The activities cover about, or in terms of the operational aspects, about 12,500 square metres. An aerial view may include some of the other components, access ways, storage sheds, those sort of things. In terms of GFA, it's only applicable to structures. So a lot of the actual shade structures aren't included in that calculation. It's probably important to note, as a side, they are moving towards more hydroponic cultivation there. So some of those shade structures are going to be replaced, and I think they are at the moment, to more I say impervious materials. And as part of the stormwater management and retaining water on the site, they're looking at recycling a lot of that. So they've got two ponds on the site. A lot of the water that ends up in those two ponds gets taken back in, recycled and used on the property. So their water usage is as efficient as it's probably ever been there.
So perhaps clarifying that, Wayne, the hard structures, sheds and the likes, are included in GFA. The softer structures, I suppose, if you call it that, for the benefit of shade structures, are not included in the calculation for GFA. So the aerial shot that's in there isn't a true representation of the footprint that it covers as far as the calculation for intensity.
Sorry, Councillor, just to clarify, we're referring to GFA in relation to infrastructure charges?
Yes, fair clarification. It was probably more in relation to site coverage of the two blocks. My question was based.
Site coverage, it's probably between 2 to 2.5 hectares in total. The infrastructure charges that was referred to by the manager relate to the wholesale nursery structures, the garden centre structures as well. But in total use area, we're probably looking at something between 2,000 to 2,500 square metres on a 4.3 hectare site.
So well within the accepted levels as far as that as an acceptable development.
Well, I think it is acceptable. It's an impact assessable application, so they're applying for something that's not strictly defined. Anything over 500 in our scheme is an impact assessment application. But I think we've placed some restrictions in terms of conditions that reflect the current site plan, where you'll see a fence for the Eagle Heights Road property be the boundary for any use. So we're restricting the use to what's currently there, and what's being proposed is sort of regenerative or replacement of shade structures and growing areas. So they're not looking to intensify anything, they'll just be consolidating.
So that condition of no further development beyond that fence, I think north of that fence, would restrict any shade structures be going to be included in that restriction?
Certainly, that's...
Yeah, so it's really, everything south is okay, no further north of that fence.
That's correct.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. Further questions, councillors? Oh, Councillor Swanbury.
Yeah, just in relation to the headworks charges, a very significant amount. Could you tell me how these headworks charges are likely to be applied?
So how they're applied, sorry?
How council's going to spend the money?
Okay, so infrastructure charges as a general rule are applied to trunk infrastructure. So that's infrastructure that has a benefit to the wider community rather than just the specific area where the development occurs. So 2011, Queensland went away from having contributions, which traditionally would be applied to, say, the road outside the development, and went to a system of trunk infrastructure through infrastructure charges. And what that does is creates funding to assist council to provide trunk infrastructure, which benefits a community, recognising that new business increases the impact on roads, increases impacts on stormwater management, and in areas that are reticulated with water and sewer, they also pay into water and sewer infrastructure charges directly to urban utilities, of course. And so it's a contribution to the any growth in the region.
Thank you. Okay, no further questions. We turn to the recommendation.
Thank you, Mayor and Councillors. This is a reasonably long recommendation, so I'm going to provide an abridged version. For the balance of information can be found in the reports from page 112 on. So the recommendation before you today is one that Council resolved to approve the development in respect to the following property: the real property description of Lot 2 RP 84569 and Lot 21 RP 891952. Address of the property is 176 to 180 Long Road and 133 Eagle Heights Road, Tamborine Mountain. The site area is 4.376 hectares and the proposal is a development permit for a material change of use involving a wholesale nursery and garden centre. 2, the currency period of approval. The currency period for this development approval is 6 years starting the day that this development approval takes effect. Refer to section 85, lapsing of approval at end of currency period of the Planning Act 2016. 3, conditions of approval. A development permit is given for a material change of use involving a garden centre and wholesale nursery, subject to the following conditions. And B, the applicant shall submit in writing to council a minimum of 3 months from the date of issuing this development permit, a complete self-assessment of all conditions of the approval. The conditions 1 through to 18. I think there might be a numbering issue there. It should be 19 beside landscape, for the benefit of the minutes, please, Sharon, listed in the table. 4, referral agency conditions, that was not applicable. And 5, there are advisory notes A through to G on pages 116. 6, further approvals are required for A building works approval is required for all building works associated with the proposed development prior to undertaking any building work on the subject property. B, an application for operational works is required prior to undertaking any filling or excavating and drainage works associated with compliance with the site-based stormwater management plan by ACS engineers dated 23 March 2021. 7, that the submitters be advised of the following. A, submitter advice approval. Council has considered all matters relevant to this application, including your submission, and has resolved to approve the application subject to listed conditions. Council is of the view that the development is competent and takes a satisfactory approach in its layout and design commensurate with the stated conditions of approval. And 8, administrative action, that a decision notice be issued in accordance with section 63 of the Planning Act 2016 to the applicant, submitters and referral agencies.
Thank you. Thank you, GM. Councillors, there's a recommendation. I seek a mover. Councillor Swamborough. Any further questions, councillors? Any further discussion to this item? Seek a seconder. Councillor McConnell. Councillor Swamborough, you wish to speak?
Just briefly, Mr Mayor. Look, this business has been a business which has existed for a long time on the mountain. It's a part of the rural economy of Tamborine Mountain. It's a big employer of staff, and it's a service that is well utilised by the community overall. I'm pleased to see that it's been regularised now in accordance with the planning scheme. It's been appropriately conditioned, and it will continue to operate as a valued business on Tamborine Mountain for a long time. Thank you.
Anyone wishing to speak against? Anyone seeking leave to speak additionally? If not, we should put the motion. Those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. We move, thank you, officers, for working through that process for us. We turn to item 10.7 today, page 146 of our agendas, and I turn to the GM Council Sustainability.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Item 10.7 today is the monthly financial report for August 2021. I apologise, I should start by saying good morning, Mayor, councillors, staff and the digital gallery. As mentioned, the report today is the financial report for August. As of 31st of August, it sees 16.66% of the financial year being completed already. The report today really is fairly low key. It has some anomalies, mainly in respect to the non-recognition or incorporating the Carryforward Budget implications, which is an item later following this matter. But some elements, and I take the report as being read, and certainly the report's detailed and gives a good analysis of the financial implications or the financial impacts as of 31st of August. Some key points I'll highlight before I open the seeking clarity on other things. The first one is the operating expenditure. It indicates there that we're $1.526 million below the budget expectations, and that's really that expenditure is detailed in part on page 154 of the report, where the majority of that is relating to materials and services of underspend, and it details in there what those items are. Some of those are relating to the materials, maintenance and operations of certainly some council facilities and services. And there's a $271,000 variance in the waste collection contract. Capital expenditure, unlike previous reports, this one's actually well ahead of schedule, and that's because of the skew of the capital projects that were budgeted for in 2021 are still continued to be delivered and expended, and it's actually seeing a $5.3 million ahead of expectations. Rates and utility charges. Page 3 of 9 of the report, or for those listening, page 151. What I will point out, Mr. Mayor, is it's good to see that the comprehensive rates modelling that the councillors undertook. You can see that the variance in the revenue from what was budgeted and what was levied was about 50,000, or that equates to a 0.001% variance on what we anticipated to be the rates modelling. So from a year-to-date revenue of 29.741 million to have a 50,000 variance is quite good. Local spend, always provide some notes around the local spend. Local spend, which is on page 155 of the report. It's indicating there that, for the month of August, we spent $1.2 million within the businesses within Scenic Rim, or around, and to year to date, that equates to still about 19%. That's lower than normal, but that's mainly due to the types of expenditures that we've seen in the last couple of months, mainly relate to a lot of the major purchases associated with renewals and subscriptions and things like that. And from a rating perspective, Mr. Mayor, which is page 156 of the report, what's indicating there is of the current levy, which was about 31.343 million for the July 2021 levy, 5.46 million remains outstanding, or around 17%. This is actually slightly higher than what it was last year, by about a couple of percent, but that's nothing to that sort of raising any concerns at this stage. We're continuing to monitor it. What I will point out, that the extended due date for the current rates levy, that, as you recall, that was extended through until 17th of September. What we've got at the moment, when I just reflect that back through the end of August, is we're seeing about an 79% take up as of end of August. And what I'm privy to, that's not included in this report, Mr. Mayor, and what I'm mindful of is trying to compare the take up of that extension, and it appears that there's a significant take up of about 8%. So whether the residents have held off or utilised that extension to amend their own cash flows, but there certainly is a good take up of that as compared to previous years. So I think it's been beneficial of council providing that extended due date. Mr. Mayor, that's what I've got highlighted for the month of August. Again, being 2 months into the financial year, we're still sort of letting the dust settle, and certainly when we come to consider the carry forwards and everything else, that'll certainly provide a better perspective of council's current position.
Thank you. Questions for the GM, councillors? Points to clarify in the report? Okay, move forward to recommendation.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. The recommendation for item 10.7 is that council endorse the monthly financial report for August 2021.
Thank you. Council will seek a mover. Councillor McConnell. Any further questions? Any further discussion to this item? Seek a seconder. Councillor West. Councillor McConnell, you wish to speak?
No, thank you.
Anyone seeking leave to speak additionally? Put the motion. Those in favour? Carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. We move to item 10.8, carry forward budget consideration, page 158 of your agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, this item now is the 2021-2022 carry forward budget review. The first review of four. Sorry, there's three more to come in where necessary. And this review really focuses on projects that were included in the 2021 financial budget, but due to matters pertaining were not quite completed by 30th of June 2021. So consideration was put forward to incorporate these as part of the 2021-2022 budget. Now, the Carryforward Budget Review provides an update of Council's financial position to the community following the adoption of the 2021-22 budget being adopted on June 24 this year. The primary driver of the review is to realign the budget to Council's operating and capital requirements. The review undertaken by various staff is undertaken and is consistent with Council's corporate plan, Scenic Rim 2026, and incorporates actual data to June 2021, plus forecast data for the remaining months of the 2021-2022 financial year. And I did mention that we do undertake a number of budget reviews throughout the year. Whilst there is no legislative requirement to revise Council's original adopted budget during the financial year, the revisions do enable Council to accommodate changing circumstances and adjust the budget for factors that were unknown at the time of the budget's original adoption, thus providing a more meaningful results when comparing actual revenue and expenditure against budgets. The revised budget today incorporates a number of capital works items included in the 2020-2021 budget that were not completed prior to 30th of June. And also, the revised budget also makes allowance for the unspent budget amounts for 2020-2021 to be carried forward to the 2021-2022, where required for the completion of these same works. Prior to going into detail around some of the key changes with the budget, Mr. Mayor, I thought I just did some analysis of especially the capital. The bulk of this is as a report contains, the consideration is to carry forward around $41.96 million of capital works into 2021. But I did some figures for the last sort of 5 years just to give some perspective around some of the volumes of capital works that Council has undertaken. And I guess since 2016-17, Mr. Mayor, there's been a total budget of about $286.477 million in capital works. Now that's been normalised to remove $62.8 million in flood damage, but that 286 includes Council's core capital expenditure, that's self-funded, as well as $96 million of external grants, subsidies and contributions. So effectively, when you start looking at those figures, what we can deduce from this is that the Council's core capital expenditure program equates to about 190 million since 2016-17, and of this core Council program, 155 million has been delivered. So by throwing in $62 million of flood damage works, as well as $96 million of externally funded works, you can see that, and I guess the workforce hasn't grown exponentially in terms of delivering that. We've actually we're quite comfortable in where things are being delivered when you take things into that account, Mr. Mayor. I guess there's been a number of factors that have seen some delays, and we've highlighted some of those impacts associated, and some of these include where realistically these projects are delivered over multiple financial years. However, from a financial perspective, we're really reporting them over 12 months. So we've taken the approach to look at those projects over multi-years and not skew the monthly reporting, so that it provides a better analysis of delivery, and the asset environmental sustainability area will certainly provide some capital works delivery to the extent of detailing where some of those discrepancies and certainly hindrances to the optimal delivery of these capital works. So the key changes, and certainly we can look to receive further clarification where required following some other notes, Mr. Mayor. But from my perspective, some of the key changes of this revised budget include, I'll find my notes. Whilst we're indicating an increase to the operating deficit of about 2.6 million, taking it from the original budget of 1.038 million to now a 3.709 operating deficit. That's largely to do with, and firstly, that's part of accrual accounting. What we've got to understand is that some of those funds associated with the grants and subsidies were received in 2021, and they're currently sitting in our bank account. However, we're showing the expenditure in this financial year, however, the revenue. So that's the beauty or the confusion around accrual accounting. That even though we're showing a $3.7 million operating deficit, really that's parlayed by, if you look at the statement of financial position, where we actually increased our cash by about 849,000. And the increase in cash has been as a net result of the review that officers have undertaken, where there have been a number of capital projects that have had some minor changes where they were originally budgeted for in 2021, but since there's been some minor amendments in the requested carryforwards that has seen a freeing up of $849,000 in available cash for council to be able to utilise on other projects. On top of the capital expenditure and grants tied expenditure, Mr. Mayor, there's also some operating programs and budgets that have been hindered throughout the year through COVID, lockdowns and everything else, that I guess there's still the requirement to provide those to the community. So the Carryforward Budget is looking to transfer or recognise about $937,000 of operating expenditure that was not delivered prior to 30th of June 2021 and looking to be delivered in this current financial year. And some of these operating expenditures include the ongoing development of strategies, including the community and cultural strategy, the Scenic Rim Growth Management Strategy, the community and camping facility strategy, sports and recreation capital works study, things like that. So they're items that were required, and they hadn't quite been completed as of 30th of June, and have been recognised to be completed this year. So the funds to complete those has been necessitated to carry the dollars into this budget. Mr. Mayor, from I guess from a sustainability indicator perspective, if I go to page 184 of the report, what this shows is the overarching impacts of how the revised budget, or how the carry-forward budget has impacted our indicators. You can see the first one there is the operating surplus ratio. When we did budget this, when council originally adopted the budget back on June 24, the 1.03 operating deficit was registered as a 1.3% deficit in the operating surplus ratio. With that additional recognition of expenditure, that has now increased to minus 4.4%, with the forward years forecast of being corrected, where the revenue and expenditure is back aligned with normal. You can see there with the significant assets, the capital works carried forward. When we adopted the budget originally back in June, we were only seeing a 78.4% asset sustainability ratio measure. That has now been increased to about 116.9, meaning that some of those legacy assets that were lacking in their conditions are now being able to be replenished and renewed. So there's still a continued approach to making sure council's assets are of a standard and build to last now and into the future. And there's just been a slight change in the cash holdings ratio, and that ratio, when it was originally adopted, was shown at 3.8. what that means is, we've got about 3.8 months of cash holdings to sort of to keep us going, liquid, and that's just slight decrease to 3.7 target. All in all, Mr. Mayor and Councillors, this carry forward budget has been reviewed extensively by officers. It certainly goes on to the emphasis to try and focus the carry forwards that are associated with grants and are needing to be delivered, and also the capital projects that have been budgeted in 2020-2021 financial year to be continued into the 2021-2022 financial year. There's some of the main notes, Mr. Mayor. I'll open now to...
We might start with some questions. Councillor Enright, you indicate.
Thank you, Mayor. A question to the General Manager. Oliver, it seems that the carry forwards have been particularly impacted by the success of our grant program. My question is, for the benefit of particularly for the gallery, could you please explain the process for handling the flow of funds that relate to approved grant-funded projects funded through Australian and Queensland governments?
I guess, like with any grant, thanks for your question, Councillor. I guess with any grants, there's a recognition of the delivery aspects as contained in the funding approval. Some of these grants could be over multiple years to deliver, and certainly that's programmed accordingly. And that's where I explained before, we're trying to build some smarts into our budgeting, but because we're trying not to solely be accountants at mind, but also incorporate the fact that a project can go over 2 years because of certain requirements. So we're looking to now reflect that accordingly, so that those that the council have committed to the projects, but also understanding that rather than set the high expectations of delivering that project fully within 12 months, when there's really only 50% of the project is to be delivered within 12 months. But recognition of that is there are certain grants and certain scenarios where, upon signing of the contract with the Queensland or the Australian government, that sometimes includes an upfront payment of a certain percentage before even any work is done. So that's an advance payment. So that's a scenario where we were faced at times when council adopted the budget in June, and all of a sudden all these inflows of grants were signed off, and we received all these funds and advance payments that made the previous year bottom line look good, because we had a lot of income but no expenditure. But then it makes the corresponding year, because that income's no longer current, but your expenditure's current, so it gives you a greater operating deficit. But those funds, they're certainly held in our bank accounts, but they're what we call restricted funds. They're assigned to particular projects. And also, I'd like to highlight that whilst we have a significant amount of dollars in the bank, what we do indicate is there are restrictions on that balance. There's an amount of employee provisions that we have to maintain: long service, sick leave, annual leave that has to be cashed back, but also tied funding grants that are being paid, but that we can't, that are particular to that particular project. So that sort of separates the need to just not look at the bank balance, but to take into account the other factors of committed works and other things in there. So,
thank you. Perhaps further to that, if grant-funded projects were either not finalised in the previous financial year, or were designed to be delivered multiple financial years, how are the revenue and expenses applied to the respective years?
I'll use an example to highlight this. Say there was an approval for a project for $1 million, and it was to be delivered over a number of years. So you had there was a 2-year time frame to deliver that project. We may get, for example, for this particular one, $100,000 up front, where we're yet to commence, but on signing of the funding agreements, the government releases 100,000. Now, that 100,000, it does sit in our bank account. It is held in restricted. However, if we haven't completed, how we currently recognise that fund is we'll show the full $1 million of income in the year that we're focusing on, and also the $1 million in expenditure. Just because when council adopts a budget, they adopt the current 12 months. You can't adopt future budgets in advance. So, this is where the accounting and the engineering sort of are at odds. Now, what we have to recognise is that project is $1 million budget, and you can, it's committed for, and it's signed off, and we'll intend to deliver it financially within 12 months, but obviously physical delivery of it will maybe over 2 years, and that's where the carry forward budgets and the budget reviews will allow if the project has only been expended 50% at that end of the particular financial year, and we need to carry forward the rest of the funds over into the next financial year, then we'll reflect that accordingly.
And if I can, just one more that's along that same line. How will the project funding be recorded for projects that are expected to continue over several financial years? And I use the example of the Bethesda Town Centre Revitalisation project that will be delivered over a 3 or 4 year type period.
Yes, so also contained in the report, where we haven't been physically paid any funds out of the, haven't recognised any revenue out of that grant, we can also carry forward the revenue side of the funding. So you'll see in the report, whilst we're also carrying forward the expenditure side, there is also the recognition of additional revenue, and I'll point to just get that, Councillor. If I go to page 163 of the report, in the middle there, the capital revenue, you can see where we originally budgeted $16 million in capital revenue for the year, and that's just recognising the capital revenue that we had for 2021-2022. But you can see the carry forward budget has increased by 11.8 million, and that's recognising those capital grants that we have yet to physically recognise coming into our payment stream. So they will come into this financial year. Now, if we don't recognise fully that 11.8, and there's a requirement to reflect that into a future budget, then we will also, and that's on the basis of that you will only get basic on ordinary funding arrangements, you will only get reimbursed for actual projects money expended by council. So it's contingent. It's contingent on council expending the funds to be provided the funds in reimbursement.
Thank you.
Thank you for that clarification.
Thank you. Councillors, other points of clarification? Councillor Swanborough.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just to Oliver, the General Manager, you said before that from 2016 up until last year we'd spent $190 million.
Sorry, 155 million we've expended. We've had a core council capital.
Yeah, sorry. So you've got 46 to carry forward. Mm-hmm. You said, yeah. So we've had our expenditure over the last 5 years, or is it 6 years? You're talking about 5 years?
5 years,
yep.
16, 17 through until 2020, 21.
So based on that, we can see over 5 years that what the organisation's been able to achieve in capital expenditure on average over the last 5 years is $31 million per year in capital expenditure. Are we biting off more than we can chew? Here we're carrying forward another 46 million, which is a whole year's capacity, and we've just added another 32 million, I think, roughly in the new budget. So whilst we had a whole year's carry forward of work to spend, we levied rates based on taking extra money for capital expenditure, of which we're not going to be able to achieve.
I guess I'll preface that before I hand over to Chris to provide some detail, particulars around the delivery. But I guess I'll preface that on the consideration by council in their rationale around budgeting. As I mentioned before, that 190 million is normalising the council. So that's council funded capital expenditure. Of that, we've expended $155 million of that. We've also, through the nature of grants and fundings, which had to be spent, if you don't spend them, you lose them, and similar with flood damage, we've also spent $150 million of those. Now, if council decides to forego, getting $100 million worth of grants externally to help us pay for some of our capital projects, then that's a decision of council. But I think where grant funding is available to help council maintain its capital assets, I think it's vital. I know there is a priority to spend that grants funded, and certainly where we can, we will try and expend that as per requirement, so that we're not left out of pocket for it. But also, I guess, with the core capital expenditure that council has in mind, we do have that work is still required. It's just the phasing of it, where we can supplement our existing capital renewals. There's a great opportunity. So, but at the end of the day, that's up to council. If and I was just pointing out before, there's been a great result in getting $100 million worth of normal grants and subsidies for the last 5 years, and through floods there's been another 62 million. So I guess it's hard to knock those back when they really add value to council's infrastructure. But
I like the assumption of knocking them back, but no one suggested that we would ever do that. And I don't think anybody around this table would suggest that either. I think it's probably unrealistic. But what is realistic is having received...
Do you have a question, Councillor?
Yes, it is a question. Having received that money, wouldn't it be prudent financially for council to then temper its revenue requests from the public in order to be able to firstly spend those grants monies, and then when they're expended, that we then go back to ratepayers and we say we need to continue our capital program at this particular level?
Could I ask a question to that?
Mm-hmm.
The grants programs we get, are they tied to specific outcomes versus what
correct.
our program tells us we need to try to deliver?
Yes, that's correct, Mr. Mayor. And again, if there was no strings attached to these grants and fundings, we'd certainly be able to be more flexible in delivering what we need to deliver. However, they're all tied to particulars, and we still have to recognise the need to, based on our asset management principles, is to recognise our assets that require the replenishing. I always jokingly say at the start of the budget period is, I ask for a new crystal ball at Christmas, so that we can predict if this level of grants and funding are going to come through for next year's budget. And it's we've seen a topsy-turvy approach at times, and it's hard to formulate a budget on the grounds that we are going to get $25 million of external funding next year. We certainly, when as officers, we try not to sugarcoat any figures on the books to say that there's a hope that we're going to get that level of funding, and that's why there's such fluctuation in the adopted budget to the the carry forward and the budget reviews. I guess we adopt our budgets external to the Queensland and the Australian governments, and sometimes their budgets play a pivotal role in the final makeup of our budget. But our timeframes do differ from theirs, and it'd be nice if they sort of all aligned and we're able to. But I certainly open up to Chris to provide some key aspects around the under delivery of that $35 million in our core, I guess if you call it that. It's, we're catching our tail in our core capital, and some of those are big ticket items. If the document outlines, there's still a fair bit of carry forwards of $5.5 million of that 35 associated with the Boat Desert Enterprise Business Precinct. There's $15 million that we're carrying forward associated with the refinancing option that council have yet to fully detail what capital project they're willing to align that to. So there's big ticket items in there. There's nothing that's sort of unsurmountable. There's been some logistics issues. There's about $3 million worth of fleet that's being carried forward just because we can't get.
Look, my question.
Sorry, Councillor, perhaps let the GM finish the response to your first question.
Thank you, Mayor and Councillors, the Executive and those listening in online. I think Oliver's done a really good job of explaining a fair portion of the carry forward. I think the main question I heard was around our ability to deliver the program as it stands or as it's proposed today with regard to the carryover that's presented. There will always be projects that...
Mr. Mayor, not necessarily the carryovers. I'm talking about our total capital works program.
Yeah, total capital works program as presented. So taking into account the carryovers that are currently presented as well as what's committed within this year's budget. Yes, thank you for that clarification there. The reality of it is that there will always be some projects that will carry over. I'm already hearing indications that as Oliver just mentioned with fleet, that unless we order a particular yellow plant very shortly, we may struggle to actually have it delivered to us by June of next year. So, and that's some of the unknowns that we're faced with at the moment. However, to actually put an order forward, we need a commitment from council through a budget. So I will already highlight that. There are also, to keep continuity of workforce, we'll start a project maybe in March, April, that will be a 6-month-long project that will actually need that committed funds for us to actually initialise that project. There are other accounting ways to actually deliver that, whether you want to put it as a staged project. However, by having security of being able to start and commit a full open up of a project, that certainly is the case. Oliver did also mention about the commitment from all the way in which grants have been provided to us. I think last year has certainly been an interesting year, for want of a better way of describing it, with regards to how grants came about. I do know, and it'd be remiss of me not to recognise both the state and federal government's awareness of the need to be somewhat forward-thinking in the way in which some of the bigger grants are provided to us, and I'll recognise that a number of them, including Bridge Renewal and National Heavy Vehicle Productivity Program, actually is divided, or you provided those funds over a number of years to take into account the pre-construction, the design and finalisation of those works, including some movement of utility services that quite often take more time than you would like to think when it comes to some of these projects. So I think it would be remiss of me not to recognise that as a multi-program delivery. I again will reiterate what Oliver stated around the crystal ball. I don't think in the last 10 years or 11 years that there hasn't been some level of curveball thrown at the organisation with regard to delivery. We can certainly put forward our best proposals. If you told me 2 years ago that we'd have a pandemic that would influence some of our supply chains the way they have, I wouldn't have believed you, but that's where we're at this point in time. Getting back to whether we can deliver, I think all things being equal, there will be some projects that won't get delivered purely because of the way they're staged. There will be some capital expenditure like fleet that won't be realised. Do we have the capability? I believe we do. We supplement our core base staff with specialist services where applicable. Previous council meeting, we did discuss the delivery of one of our facilities projects that has certainly been impacted by the boom in the construction industry. So the reality of it is that we're some of what you see as a carryover today is as a direct result of the influence in price as well as the availability of those sort of skill levels. So the long and the short of it is, I think, yes, we are in a position that we can deliver a fair portion of what is listed in the Covert program, and certainly over the coming weeks and months, I will certainly provide updates on those projects as they move forward.
Further questions, councillors? I have a question for the GM Asset and Environmental Sustainability. There was a particular insurance type event that happened 17 into 18 into 19, a 2-year program of works to recover from floods, which was something like $63 million. Was that able to be delivered in parallel over that approximate 2-year window with other capital programs that we were undertaking? As I recall, at that time, there were some substantial parallel investments in co-funded bridge renewal programs, which was quite a significant capital works expansion of the team and the capacity to deliver quite a significant capacity over that period of time. Would that be correct?
Yes, that's correct. And that was achieved through actually achieving by the right mix between our own, utilising our own core workforce, supplemented with what I call mum and dad contractors, as well as some of your smaller construction contractors who we've built quite a good relationship with over a period of time. So where possible, the core business that council's good at, which is our gravel road networks and building of our sealed road network, was certainly what we focused on our own internal staff delivering. When it came to the concrete bridge side of things, that's a specialised field, and we certainly utilised specialised contractors to deliver that as well. And certainly they assisted at the same time with some of the aspects of the flood program. So, and with that, you certainly need that back end or office support through project management teams. And we've actually built some reasonable, or I would believe, good relationship with some project management companies to actually provide us that additional support in managing the delivery of those projects.
Thank you. GM Council Sustainability, if I recall correctly, there's nominally 42 million of carryover as per today's report, 41.96. The $15 million of additional borrowings that's been made available through the change of facility with QTC, which has certainly done two things. One, reduced the cost to serve existing borrowings, but two, opened up the capacity for future, for us to make determinations to bring forward other activities. When was that brought into our accounts as council?
Thanks, Sir. Yes, that was brought into account. The funds were actually received just after the actual adoption of the budget in June 2021. So, there was no opportunity to spend any of those dollars, or there had been no planning at that particular point in time as well.
Thank you for that clarification. So that 15 million is represented in that 42 million?
That's correct, Mr. Mayor, and I've just got on the screen there, page 172. So it forms part of the report, and you can see this report is a detailed capital carry forward projects report. So the way this report reads, and it's very transparent in identifying all the carry forwards that have been requested, shows that in 2021, the budget year to date for that additional capital projects of $15 million, and then on the right column there, The revised annual budget is $15 million. If we go to another similar example, section 210 libraries, you can see there's a hire of a demountable building to extend the Bow Desert Library. That was scheduled to be undertaken last year. However, due to circumstances, that's still requiring, because it still poses some workplace health and safety issues in terms of staffing accommodation at the current library, and that's looking to be realised in this financial year. So that's the way that how the report sort of reads and details in particular all those items that are being considered as part of this review process.
Thank you, GM. Could I ask you then, just to try to crystallise this, from the comments that you responded to Councillor Enright, it's very clear that there's not a homogenous bucket of carry forward. It's quite a number of elements, and it's perhaps helpful to, at a high level, just understand those components. And perhaps the first is to ask is, so in all of this quite detailed review, what's the overall dollar value of carry forwards for projects or programs, perhaps operational, that are ongoing from the prior year? That is, projects that have already been progressed, like we've heard the Enterprise Drive Precinct, but are still to be finalised. What would that be at a dollar value in this carry forward?
Mr. Mayor, that would be the lion's share, if anything, and then certainly the only stuff that's that by exception, I suppose, that we're looking at was that $937,000 of other operating expenditure that was required to be recognised, that wasn't necessarily grant funded or anything else. So the lion's share, that $41 million, is really the you know, what we're focusing on, and I guess you know, in a high level summary, Mr. Mayor, when I'm looking at the split of that $41 million in capital, you know, we see facilities management, that grouping increase from $845,000 to $3.3 million. You know, VATV, which includes the Bow Desert town revitalisation as well as the Enterprise Precinct, that's gone from $6.4 million to $15 million, recognising those carry forwards, those works. The groupings, again, this is all contained in the report. I'm just providing sort of a high level summary. Grouping that's contained, that's called capital works. Yeah, that's increased from 7.995 million up to 12.463 million. Some of the key projects in that are, you know, grant funded under the DRFA, Head Road, Carney's Creek, a number of footpaths, the Bow Desert Narang works for the cycle network program, and part of some of the Unite and Recover community stimulus, which includes a number of footpath projects, you know, Calbar, and things like that. Structures and drainage, which is sort of key. You know, that's gone from $7 million to just over 11 million. The bulk of those, you know, that $4 million increase, 2.5 million of that relates to Flying Fox Bridge, the rehabilitation works for that. There's $1.4 million carry forward in there. The Spring Creek Bridge at Kerry Road, there's just over $1 million in carry forward for there, as well as other sort of varying structures and drainage associated works, Mr. Mayor. So, you know, whilst I can't give you a dollar sort of estimate, I guess by exception is that $937,000 of the works relates to those sort of ad hoc programs that were not delivered upon operationally in 2021, but has been as part of the commitment to the community to assist in recovering and getting out of the impacts of the pandemic. It's, you know, continue to deliver some of those health and wellbeing sessions and other activities and things like that.
Thank you. A further question. As per, you've indicated an example, an earlier comment on page 163 of the report that there's a substantial carry forward of capital revenue not already received but funding to be received. So what is that dollar value of carry forward of either funding not yet received but allocated to us or received for multi-year projects not yet able to commence or not yet programmed to commence because of the timing for those programs from either state or federal grant programs?
I don't have that particular calculation with me, Mr. Mayor, but I can certainly take on notice and provide that at the September monthly financial, which I guess it's the September monthly financial will incorporate the carry forward budget, which will then identify in detail those funds and those funds received as per the normal dynamics in there. So that will be able to be. So
as per your earlier comment, is it a reasonable interpretation that there's at least 11 plus million of that is funds not yet received but shown there as a revenue stream?
Yes, that's correct. So we've seen the just in capital alone of 11.85 and operating grants of 2.393 million. That's going to be reflected. Sorry, Mr. Mayor, I thought you might have been querying about the funds that we've received and they're held in restriction, but that's correct. There's that's contributed to recognising those funds being recognised. So that's part of the delivery of those projects. So the expenditure side, we're also recognising the revenue side.
Thank you. I just have two other questions, and certainly one of these may well be more applicable to the GM of Asset and Environmental Sustainability. Conscious that we have some very significant seasonal variabilities that have affected the timing of programs such as localised flooding and events earlier in the year, and the subtlety of when it's best to deliver programs. Are there dollar values or material dollar values in this carry forward for programs that really have been delayed because of seasonal impacts that vary the ability to deliver them effectively?
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, the approximate value of those works is around $4.4 million, one of which was reseals, unfortunately. Normally for a reseal program, we actually time that with September, October. Thankfully this year, we're about to start delivery of the first package of the reseal program. So that was one program where we were late in putting and through resourcing issues that we had at the time, late in getting the contract together. Once it was awarded, we then had some wet weather, and then once we'd finished our works with that, we then found that the temperature on the ground was just too cold, and like I've said previously, to get a good quality outcome for the community, wait until ground temperatures increase. Interestingly, looking at the weather forecast for the next couple of days, that may still impact on our ability to get that consistent 20 degrees plus on ground conditions. So that is one. And certainly I will say that we did have some issues with regard to some heavy rainfall around March of this year that did impact. So in total, it's around that $4.4 million.
Thank you for that clarification. There's certainly some complexity in these numbers. My last, and certainly if you say they're telling this morning that Stanthorpe's, I think, on snow watch, so some soil temperatures in the west might be a challenge for works. But just one further question to the GM, to either GM perhaps. Conscious of the comment earlier that there are unprecedented supply chain constraints globally because of COVID limiting supply chain for various reasons. What's the dollar value in these carryovers of that are driven directly by those limitations, those abnormal limitations of supply chain capability?
I have put a bit of thought to that particular question. I'm often reminded that it's more than one thing that actually will end up influencing the delaying of a project, but where there has been some, or the delivery of a particular capital item, it is of the order, and it's not necessarily directly as a result of COVID, but could be linked to that. Somewhere between that $3.5 to $5 million of works have had some level of touch point that may certainly have been influenced by either supply chain issues, increased cost in delivery, or resources availability. So that's certainly of the order of what has been impacted or influenced in being able to achieve delivery per the timetable that had previously been set by the team members.
Thank you for those clarifications. Much appreciated. Are there any other questions, councillors? Councillor Swamborough.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, just my question to the GM Sustainability. What is the level of infrastructure depreciation in this year's budget?
Dollar value, that's on page 163 of the report. You can see there that hasn't changed. It's about 17.728 million.
I wonder if the GM could explain the concept of renewals, and my question would be, with our capital budget, despite all the carry forwards and everything, what priority is given to spending money on the basics, the bread and butter sort of stuff that we need to do to keep our assets at their working condition at the moment? Is that a priority for us, and will that renewal spending be impacted by all these other new grant funding monies and everything that we've got to spend going forward?
Thanks, Councillor. I'll hand the technical questions over to Chris to answer, because I mean some of those pertain to basic asset management principles, I guess, in renewing our assets. But I guess from an accounting perspective, just reflecting on that depreciation amount of 17.7 million, whilst that's recognised as an expense, that's then used to fund obviously our capital expenditure. So we charge ourselves that depreciation, and then that's utilised as part of our capital funding. And how that's derived is obviously a calculation of all the assets and how they've depreciated, based on condition assessments, how they've depreciated, and it's the necessary assessments to undertake is based on service level reviews of those assets and to what standard they need to be renewed. You asked a query about potentially the different classes of capital expenditure. So the main focus and the main focus of that asset sustainability ratio is our renewals. So any new assets don't count for that because they're new. In the subsequent years, the renewal will be incorporated. But you've got new assets, renewals, or upgrades is generally the different classes when it comes to capital expenditure. And I might pass over to Chris when about identifying the projects and their priority levels and how that's.
I might leave that for another day because it is fairly complex, but I will say that I remember a long time ago the catch cry renew before new, and I still remind staff of that as the first thing you need to think about when putting forward a project. However, when you start looking at some of the infrastructure that we are replacing, we're not in a position to be able to replace like for like. The reality of it is when an example would be where there's a reasonable level of investment, well, I should say a substantial level of investment has previously been on Beachmont Road. I could think of Bunbilla Road in the west over numerous years where the road itself originally was around that, varied from 3.5 to 4 metres seal out to 5.5 metre seal. Given the standards of today, it's inappropriate to just invest to that standard or rehabilitate to that standard. So part of what Oliver's alluding to there is although we may see a capital investment in, say, a road network of, say, $15 million, a portion of that goes to an upgrade portion, and only the portion that is the renewal of the existing that actually goes towards that funded. So looking at Carry Road, for example, there's vast sections of that would be barely 3 metres wide in seal, with shoulder wear that adds to an operational cost, and that the reality when you go to rebuild it back, you actually need to widen the road, which involves drainage works, some earthworks and other matters that go along with that as well. So I think that's just sort of touching the surface of the question that you've asked, but the reality of it is that we have a prioritisation model within each of our asset classes and groups, and certainly that's based, or there is some information for those that want to chase it up on it within the strategies that are available on Council's website. They have got a few years on them as far as age, and they're over the next 12, 18 months, we're certainly going to look at reviewing and updating those strategies. So, and making sure that that they're true to what has been updated within our current asset management plans.
Thank you. Do you have further question, Councillor Swanberg?
Yes, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Mayor, we've probably only recently, in the last few months, adopted a new asset management plan, and it talks a lot about renewals and the need for us to concentrate on maintaining the existing assets that we have. And I see that in the budget documents on page 184 of the report, it does have an asset sustainability ratio, and luckily for us this year, it's going to be 116.9%, which means we're going to spend well and truly more than the 17.72 million of our depreciation costs. So we're actually renewing more than we're losing in essence. But going forward into those future years, we see that there's a big drop off, and it goes right through to 2030, where we're only covering 67.5% of our assets. So that means that, we've got a 33% decline in the standard of our assets going forward at that particular mark, because we're not concentrating on renewals. And if we haven't got a workforce that can concentrate on renewals and get that done, the consequences of that are that our roads and our bridges and our playgrounds and buildings and whatever are going to be in decline. And this is an indicator.
Councillor, can you ask the question, not
yeah, I was getting to the
theory,
question.
please.
I was getting the question.
Well,
is this an indicator? Is this an indicator, in the long-term indicators, that we're on a pathway to declining the standard of our assets that we have at the moment?
Thanks for that question, Councillor Swanberg. And I guess, and I already wrote some notes down because I just should have added some commentary before. But when you asked what the level of depreciation was, and I said it was 17.728 million as a percentage of the original budget, this is where we're just talking about core council infrastructure. Yeah, that represents about 47% funding of the original capital expenditure program of 37.3 million. Now, what we've done now is, with the incorporations of carryforwards and recognitions of all those other grants, that 17.728 million only reflects a 22% contribution of the overall $78 million capital expenditure program. So I guess, I touched on it briefly before, but what we put forward are conservative figures. Those forward-year budgets really take into account council's ability to fund or to the extent of being able to fund capital works programs with moderate or conservative revenue streams. There's no factoring or sugarcoating some of the revenue sides. We're saying that we should get millions of dollars worth of revenue to help us offset some of that. There's none of those. So some of those items where they're not recognised is, council have got to make that consideration around additional borrowings to fund some of those. So it's really, those forward-year ones are based on own source revenue. And what we're saying is we're trying to maintain a high level, and but at a sustainable level, not just to council, but the ratepayers in the community, because you can certainly improve that by increasing revenue to make our assets. And we've always recognised that that assets are always going to be a legacy items. They're always going to we're going to uncover where there's going to be some asset failures because they haven't been duly maintained or properly budgeted for in the past. So whilst we've got the opportunity with the levels of funding from this the Queensland and Australian governments, that's where welcoming those with open arms, allowing us to go from our original budget of 78.4% renewals to 116%. That catches up on some of that some of those assets that needed renewal, but we weren't able to. We were trying to spread the dollar as best we could, in effect. So those forward years in terms of asset sustainability, they're really based on own source funding, and there's no recognition that we're going to get the same levels of capital and operating grants, even in the 2 years advance. You can see that the if I can get shown to go to page 163. You can see in those couple of years in the capital grants, we budgeted 16. The future years are declining because we know that some of those multi-year ones we can lock them in, but the future ones are, at 12 million and 6 million in the future years. And you can see also that the depreciation is increasing. So if we can arrest the depreciation, it'd be nice to build assets that don't depreciate. That way, then we'd reach that happy equilibrium.
Sorry, Councillor, you finished?
Oh, I was just going to ask the question. So the own source revenue, 37.3 million, and the depreciation, the infrastructure depreciation, 17.72 million. So we actually raise a lot more from our own source revenue to cover our renewals, but surely it's not a question of increasing the revenue. It's a question of what our priorities are in relation to where we spend our own source revenue as far as that capital goes. Isn't that a choice that we get to make?
That's correct, and you do make that when during the budget process we outline the other aspects. From an operational perspective, the budget's not just about the capital aspects. With the budget being adopted at $1 million operating deficit, you've got to account for that deficit in capital funding, because you're starting your capital funding $1 million below. Then you've got to take into account loan repayments and things like that. So there are a lot of aspects once you take out the operational side of things. It sort of pans out. So we do provide that in a detailed version when we do go into deliberations around budget and really detailing the start to finish impacts associated with the relevant transactions. So happy to in future budgets for focus to be on that, and then certainly questions are arising as part of it.
Just you finished, Councillor. So just a question to either of the two GMs who've been providing answers. What percentage, off the top of your head, what percentage of the programs that we've been able to get grant funding for from a capital point of view have been pull forwards of renewal activities identified out of forward years that have been able to be brought forward over particularly the last couple of years, with some of the recovery funds that have been available in the grants, such as last year with the Covert, Unite and Recover, etc.?
Mr. Mayor, without being held to account for the exact dollar figures, but I can recall a number of transactions. You might recall last year with some of the footpath projects, there was a number of footpath projects in future years that, as part of our 10-year capital works delivery, we were able to bring those forward, and that, that particular program was $1,078,000 originally. There, part of the ongoing bridge replacement project, some of those big ticket items were in future years that were brought forward to utilise that. So, in effect, that we all, and certainly when we try and forecast, we have council endeavours to have to build in that foresight in structuring it as a 10-year forecast. So there is the ability to review those 10 years where funding becomes available now, and there's a particular project that's in advance that wasn't originally earmarked or proposed, and certainly that can be brought forward. And sometimes it's, talking about grants and fundings, it's sometimes some of the restrictions are that you can't utilise the grant funding for things that exist in your budget already. So it's a catch-22. Do we show those things in our 10-year forecast and then they become ineligible to use as funding? So then you actually have to find a new project that wasn't contained in that schedule. So, but I think, the way the Queensland government has structured some of their the grants programs now, they've allowed some flexibility along the way. So we're certainly grateful in the way they've been accommodating in that aspect. But yeah, there's still the hindrance around that it can't be already budgeted for.
I was going to add a little more. Thank you, Oliver, again for explaining that very well. The reality of it is when you start looking at the level of, when you actually look at the asset sustainability ratio, because 1 year you're funding 66% of renewal, you're not actually seeing a net decrease in the serviceability of your overall network, because you're dealing with assets in some cases like some of our concrete bridges that have a life of 120 years. And as you build a new concrete bridge, you then start depreciating it, and it does have an impact, even though over a long lifetime. I think if you look back at the level of investment and our sustainability ratio, we've been able to achieve quite a lot through leveraging with, whether it be through flood programs or other grant funding through the bridge renewal, or in the case of Carry Road, where we're actually getting some national heavy productivity funding to actually assist with that. So just to assist with what Oliver's saying, I think looking forward, we also need to look back and actually assess and understand how we've been able to target and maximise opportunities as they come along. So also, a lot of this is based around what our current 10-year capital works program looks like and some of the key strategies of council. Now, understanding that recently we've received quite a numerous amount of grant funding within the bring forwards for footpaths, that may, for our next year's round of looking at how we treat our renewal of assets, it's a decision of council to whether we continue to maintain the level of funding, seeing that we've brought forward several years of forward works of new upgrades to footpaths, to actually look at whether that's where you want to continue that same level of investment. Because I can remember back 10 years ago when we were investing nowhere near enough in footpaths to actually keep ahead of the degradation of the footpaths we currently had. We're from memory, and I'm going to trust my memory, we need to invest about $400,000 a year in our current footpath network. We see, if you look at within the budget, it was $4 million actually allocated into footpaths, of which most were new. However, we were able to do some renewal in amongst that as well. So we had an ongoing strategy of investing at least half of, or over a 10-year average, into the renewal of footpaths. So the reality of it is, moving forward, that's certainly something we can look at. So I think, keeping in mind what you see in front of you is based on the 10-year capital works program as presented, and will be well, the team are currently working on it at the moment. There'll be drafts available to council probably November, December for adoption for planning purposes and to start the rejigging of the graphs for the next year's budget as well. So teams are working on that right now, and that will certainly, and there are some scenarios that we'll certainly bring forward to council to discuss around levels of investment, because the long-term financial forecast does provide a guide to staff on where are the levels of investments in assets. And certainly that's a more detailed conversation for another day, but I just thought it'd be remiss of me not to actually mention that today, given the tone of the conversation.
Thank you. Okay, any other questions, councillors? I see Councillor Chalk waving, so I presume not. We move forward to recommendations, please. GM.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The recommendation for item 10.8 is that council adopt the budget adjustments as contained in the 2021-2022 Carryforward Budget Review contained in attachment 1.
Thank you. Seeker mover. Councillor Enright. Any additional questions, councillors? Additional discussion? I'll seek a seconder. Councillor McConnell, wish to speak? Councillor Enright.
Thank you, Mayor. Look, I think the last 3/4 an hour was valued input. I think it shows that it's a complex business. The opportunities that come with state and federal government funding adds another layer of complexity, but the underlying benefit is that it provides the opportunity for us to deliver more for our community, significantly more and significantly quicker. And it's just the challenge of juggling accounting and engineering, if I can simplify it like that, to allow this to fit into place so that we can deliver the programs and account for it accordingly. And I commend the efforts of all of the GMs and their teams to produce this snapshot of where we're at the moment. So commend the motion.
Thank you, councillor. Anyone wishing to speak against? Not seeking leave to speak additionally? Not put the motion. Those in favour? It's carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. And again, I agree. Thank you for the work that's gone into preparing and doing those analyses for today. It's much appreciated. Councillors, that brings us to the end of the open matters before council. And we have 2 items in confidential as per declarations. There are 2 of us who will absent from that, but just for the visibility of the digital gallery, the process now is that we will go through the vote to move into closed. Given the time, we will actually pause for lunch before we open in closed, but when we open in closed, we will then have 2 of us leave the meeting and the Deputy Mayor will take over and chair that conversation before we then return into open. I am not going to estimate how long that conversation will take because I won't be part of it. So we will ask for a vote in a moment and then we'll go for half hour for lunch before the meeting reconvenes in closed under the oversight of the Deputy Mayor. And I'm not sure how long that discussion will take. So all I can say to those watching, if you're able, if you want to continue to listen later, you'll just have to watch for when it returns. But for now, I seek a motion to move into closed session. Councillor McConnell, a seconder. Councillor West. Needs any discussion? Those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. Good afternoon to you in the digital gallery for now. We'll talk to you later. For those who are still with us in the digital gallery, welcome back. Councillors, I seek a motion to return to open meeting. Councillor McConnell, seconded. Councillor West. Those in favour? I can't see Councillor Chalk anywhere.
Yeah.
Righto, thank you. Back in open session, Councillor Enright, I'll return the meeting to you for consideration of the resolutions. We'll return to close.
Thank you, Mayor. Just noting that Mayor Christensen and Councillor Swanber are leaving the chamber. Move on to 11.1 and ask the CEO to read out the recommendation.
Recommended that one, council acknowledge the investigation process applied to the referral to investigate inappropriate conduct from the Office of the Independent Assessor, brackets reference C-20-008-8, close bracket. 2, following the outcome of the investigation, council decide that the subject councillor has not engaged in inappropriate conduct. Item 3, council acknowledge the investigator's recommendation and consider amending council standing orders procedure CM03.01PR.01 prior to 30 June 2022. 4, council send an acknowledgement to the Office of the Independent Assessor of council's resolve on the matter and that the outcome be reflected in the councillor conduct register. And 5, in accordance with clause 22.6.3 of the Scenic Rim Regional Council Standing Orders Procedure CM03.01PR.01, council maintain confidentiality over the contents of the officer's report, including the investigation report and attachments, and due to privacy obligations, the report not be released.
Do I have a mover for this motion? Moved, Councillor McConnell. Any further questions? Do I have a seconder? Move, Councillor West. I will just put this. All those in favour? Against? Carried unanimously. Thank you. Moving to item 11.2. Ask the CEO to outline the recommendation.
Sorry, Councillor, sorry about that. The recommendation is that one, council acknowledge the investigation process applied to the referral to investigate inappropriate conduct from the Office of the Independent Assessor, brackets reference C-20-00723, close bracket. 2, following the outcome of the investigation, council decide that the subject councillor has engaged in inappropriate conduct and that in accordance with the Local Government Act 2009 section 150AH bracket 1 bracket small a, council order no action be taken. 3, council schedule additional training and awareness of the Queensland Government's Code of Conduct for councillors in Queensland for all elected members prior to 31 December 2021. And 4, council send an acknowledgement to the Office of the Independent Assessor of council's resolve on the matter and that the outcome be reflected in the councillor conduct register. And 5, in accordance with clause 22.6.3 of the Scenic Rim Regional Council Standing Orders Procedure CM03.01PR.01, council maintain confidentiality over the contents of the officer's report, including the investigation report and attachments, and due to privacy obligations, the report not be released.
If I could move a motion, please, Mr Chair.
Yes.
I'd like to move a motion that each of these items be voted on separately.
We have a seconder for that motion.
Happy to second.
Seconded by Councillor West. I'll just put that motion. Those in favour? Marshall? Carried unanimously. Thank you. Now moving to the recommendation. I'll ask for the first point of that recommendation. Do I have a mover? And we might just read through what that item is.
I'll just reread item 1. That council acknowledges the investigation process applied to the referral to investigate inappropriate conduct from the Office of the Independent Assessor, in brackets reference C-20-00723, closed bracket.
Do I have a mover for that motion? Moved Councillor West. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Chalk. Those in favour? Marshall? Carried unanimously. Motion 2.
Motion 2. Following the outcome of the investigation, council decide that the subject councillor has engaged in inappropriate conduct and that in accordance with the Local Government Act 2009, section 150AH, bracket 1, bracket small a, council order no action be taken.
Do I have a mover for that motion? Move Councillor McConnell. Seconder?
I'll be the second.
Councillor Chalk. Those in favour?
Favour.
Those against?
Division, please, Mr Chair.
Division called. Those in favour? Councillor Divisions 2, 3 and 5. Against? Division 4. Motion 3. CEO, if you could read that.
Motion 3. Council schedule additional training and awareness of the Queensland Government's Code of Conduct for councillors in Queensland for all elected members prior to 31st December 2021.
Do I have a mover for that motion?
Happy to
Move
move.
Councillor West. Seconder? Councillor McConnell. Those in favour? Marshall? Just waiting for Marshall to respond.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, thank you. Carried unanimously. Motion 4. CEO, if you could read when it's available.
Thank you. Motion 4 is that council send an acknowledgement to the Office of the Independent Assessor of council's resolve on the matter and that the outcome be reflected in the councillor conduct register.
Do I have a mover for that motion? Move Councillor West. Seconder? Councillor McConnell. Those in favour?
In favour.
Carried unanimously. Motion 5. Thank you, CEO.
Directing Chair. Motion 5, in accordance with clause 22.6.3 of the Scenic Rim Regional Council Standing Orders Procedure CM03.01PR.01, Council maintain confidentiality over the contents of the officer's report, including the investigation report and attachments, and due to privacy obligations, the report not be released.
I have a mover for that motion. Move Councillor West. Seconder? Councillor McConnell. Those in favour?
Favour.
Motion carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. That now concludes 11.2. We will invite the Mayor and Mayor and Councillor Swanborough back into the chamber.
Now declare the meeting closed. Noting that meeting close at 3:40. Good afternoon to those in the gallery. See you in a fortnight.